Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I can't be more thrilled about talking to the group, and I really, really appreciate it. So thank you very much. And I'd just like to acknowledge all the sponsors for our program as well. And the Geoheritage Conference has been just wonderful. I've been really enjoying it. But today I'd like to start off just talking a little bit about the new program, a new NPO that we've started in the last year. It actually just started up in late December, but we've been around kind of working under the umbrella of another NPO. And this is all looking at geoheritage from the perspective of science storytelling with puppetry for young learners. So how do we reach out to the really young and talk about our science, talk about geoheritage and get them excited? And we all know geologists are time travelers. You know, we read the rocks, we're out there interpreting, and in the wonderful landscape here in South Africa, we have the most compelling places on Earth, in my opinion, having lived here, moved here 8 years ago from the US. But it's an incredible place. As we all know, the deep history is amazing. And so how do we convey this to young learners, as young as we can get them? And we are looking at the animals, the plants, the great biodiversity that we have around us, and how this has made it through all these pulses of mass extinctions over the hundreds of millions of years. And how do we convey this to this sense of deep time to especially the very young? And so our whole focus with this new NPO is to excite really young learners, get them interested, push, the content, the cutting edge discoveries, interactions with real scientists as much as possible. And we're doing this through using the vehicle of storytelling. And of course, it's in our DNA. It's the core of human experience is to tell stories. And we've been doing this from the dawn of time when the earliest parts of human history. And the stories are what really engage, especially young children, really anyone of any age. And so the stories that we want to tell are captured in the rock. And some of these, I hate these controls go right over my slides. Some of these stories, those of environmental change, mass extinctions, adaptation, evolution, these are very compelling. And there's just such a wealth of wonderful fossils and collections that we can use to kind of breathe life into these stories and make them come really relate and come to life for young learners in particular. One problem we face is how do we teach these concepts? So it's great to have programs for young learners in museums and other venues, but then the real problem is how do we support our education system? How do we support teachers? And the problem is teaching Earth and space science is hard. And our teachers are faced with teaching topics about the solar system, space exploration, climate change, deep history of life. These are all really difficult topics to teach. And I think that our teachers really struggle with this. And part of the problem is also that they don't have a lot of resources to work with. They may not have web connections. They don't have enough training. So it's a really difficult situation for them. And so I've been working through UCT's School Development Unit for about 5 years and doing teacher professional development. So I'm very aware of the struggles that they have. And so the idea with this new NPO is to develop resources that we can help support teachers. But these topics are really difficult. Let's see, how come my slide's not going forward? There we go. And the other issue that we have is because the teachers aren't prepared as well as they could be, student engagement really suffers. And so if the teachers aren't really well prepared and the topics are difficult, the teachers tend to fall back on, not the greatest pedagogical systems. They have no choice, but they tend to fall back on just a rote kind of less engagement for the students is the outcome, basically. And so with new training and options, we're hoping, and more development for teachers, we can kind of get, and better programs, we can get at the root of some of these problems. And what we tend to get are teachers that kind of using the sage on the stage, very teacher-centered approach. And we don't want that. We want more of these other two images here where we have student-centered, active learning, hands-on learning environments. So we want to try to get the content into that kind of scenario, which is really liberating for teachers as well, because they can really enjoy themselves and learn and use different pathways for teaching. And one solution that I've come across is the arts integrated learning pathways. And this embraces the whole concept of STEAM. And I'm sure you've heard of this as science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, kind of the old STEM that we used before this. And the big addition here is the arts integration. And this is a huge kind of focus now in many of the learning environment and the learning communities. And it involves both project-based learning, where students work in groups, design thinking, where they have iterations of development, prototyping, and then testing, and then also personalized learning, where there's smaller groups and students are kind of involved in a lot of peer activities, and the teacher's more of a facilitator rather than a, kind of spoon feeding the content. Many people, when you think about science teaching, a lot of teachers, a lot of people in general kind of view it as a very not very creative endeavor. Like you're sitting in the microscope with your lab coat on, or you're trudging around in the field. It doesn't sound that exciting, but science is extremely creative. It's a creative endeavor, and there's been a lot of push in the education community in the last, 5 to 10 years about pushing these other pathways and kind of emphasizing the creativity behind good science. This kind of leads into inspiring this use of the arts as another pathway for teaching science and making meaning in your teaching. And there's lots of articles out there. This is a cool article about the Alvarezes. You may have heard of them. They played a very central role in discovering the iridium anomaly for the mass extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs. And so this is a great article talking a little bit about Luis Alvarez, the son of Walter, who was this bright student who had the opportunity to go be put in a college type environment and as a young boy. And his father ended up putting him in a trade school. And there he did lots of courses on drawing and woodworking and did all these other endeavors that are more craft and arts focused, which really helped develop his visual thinking, his visualization abilities, his 3D thinking. And he ended up going on to make these great discoveries with his father. And he actually, this article talks a little bit about his background and what really helped him by going this path with more arts and being involved. And so it really emphasizes the skills that scientists use, like observation and thinking in 3D and those types of skills that we want our students to develop. The power of art-centered learning, I'm really trying to push this and make a case for it, because I'm always wondering if people are like, oh, arts, it's not very rigorous, but it really is. And there's a lot of ways to incorporate cutting edge science in this type of approach. And so there's lots of research that's been done over the past 5-10 years, as I mentioned, and to look at how it's sort of changed the outlook and the importance of teaching the arts. And it's kind of the biggest thing that really resonated with me is that it has the power to emotionally charge, really emphasize that with which it depicts. And so it's, and also kind of helps students feel less intimidated and teachers less intimidated by the science, which can be very, overwhelming and very alien to them in some ways if they haven't had much exposure to it. In other aspects, using this kind of approach also can have significant impact in the classroom. And so there's some new studies out in the last few years about how behavioral issues and positive emotions come through this type of approach in teaching science in the classroom, and how it can actually impact disadvantaged communities. And there's a really neat meta-analysis study here talking about how they're monitoring the students' grades and social skills and creative thinking, and how this was a very positive outcome for integrating the arts in the classroom here. The downside is that it does require more teacher preparation, and teachers need to find ways to integrate the arts into their classroom that are, you need a little bit of like training, and that's another area where we're hoping to get involved in the community, is helping teachers learn some of these skills which are really fun and engaging. So hopefully they'll enjoy that. The other point I wanted to make here was the students can learn the arts as they're doing it. They learn different skills, but there's also lots of ways to bring this into programs and into the classroom. And it can be through entry events. It can be through culminating products and performances. It can be creative, lots of other ways to kind of work that in. But it's really great because these activities will often relate very closely to good scaffolding practices and assessment for that matter. And if you think about it, the scaffolding, or kind of building these structures that support the culmination of knowledge through different kind of through a progression. The sensory and interactive and graphic scaffolding are all supported by art activities. And if you look at these lists, you can see there's lots of diagrams and working in groups and using tables and charts and visualizations. And that's all very important for scaffolding knowledge, especially for young learners. If we think about doing science instruction, we always kind of, in our own minds, are thinking about inquiry. So how can we not kind of give out the knowledge and scientific discoveries and kind of rote memorization, but how do we get students to kind of discover and explore this on their own? And with arts integration, it's actually kind of embedded in the whole process. If you think about doing an art project, you get inspired by something and you may investigate it further, look at the topic and what kind of activities you can do. And it's a lot of self-expression, reflection, and then this iterative making it and improving it and trying it again. So it's the inquiry is kind of embedded in the art itself, so in the activities. So that's kind of a neat aspect of it as well. And you may be wondering, well, is this actually being used outside of this program that I'm talking about? But it's actually all over the country in the US and Europe. There's been whole school districts that have rolled out art-centered learning in their science curriculums across the board, mostly in secondary, probably what we would call foundation and intermediate phase. But the K through arts integration in the US and other places is very popular right now. These are just some new publications that have been out there kind of showcasing what some of these districts are doing. Here in South Africa, we come back to that problem of teaching the CAPS strands, our CAPS alignment, the curriculum that we use in South Africa for science. And we have the main strand that we focus on for geoheritage, as you probably all know, is the Earth and Beyond strand. This is a difficult one to teach, but it actually fits in so well with art-centered pathways of learning. And so if we look at some of the topics within these strands, like here's Earth and Beyond, Life and Living, here's some topics that I teach in our program right now. And you can see there's a lot of linkages here, Life and Living and Earth and Beyond. There's this, you can really integrate these topics together through programs, and especially through the storytelling. So we can really find ways to kind of pull in other strands, but also really support the earth science and geoheritage. So I had this idea about 2 years ago. Since I grew up with Sesame Street, I love puppetry, and I just happened to be doing some research about an idea I had of developing a program, an NPO, not-for-profit, that could take puppetry and tell science stories. And so I just happened to be doing research for about 6 months on this. And then I ran across this local youth theater, community theater company called Jungle Theater in Cape Town. This was through an environmental discussion group that I was in. And I really, what they're doing really resonated with me. They're doing a lot of community-based theater in the townships and for other groups around all over South Africa, actually. And they've been around for about 20 years. Doing this after-school arts programs, creative drama clubs. We got together and discussed an idea that I had about having this puppetry program, and Puppet Planet was born. And so we came up with this art-centered program using puppetry. Here's our website. And I won't play this video, but let me just turn the sound off for you. Here we go. But we're kind of developed a program using large rod puppets, and we have a central character. this little girl, Tandy. She's living on a Karoo, on a little farm on the Karoo, and she has a dog, Uchis, and they have this, the dog is magical. They can go back and forth in time. And this is a program for young learners to explore geoheritage. And we started out with the idea of framing it as a children's TV and radio show, because this was in the pandemic. It was very hard to do live performances. We had theater that we worked with, but all those places were closed. And so we just decided to focus more of our energies on the TV show. So we would record these live performances. The production uses 3 languages. It has an English base with Afrikaans and Xhosa as much as possible woven in. And these are done in a theater environment. We capture them as broadcast quality videos, and then we air them on local TV shows. And we've so far been working with the Cape Town Television Network, which is a not-for-profit, a local community network. So we're hoping to get our show out there on more a wider range of networks if possible. And our target audience is young learners from disadvantaged communities. So we have the performers that we use are from those communities, and we really like to work with them and get their experiences kind of as much as possible into the puppet shows. And it's a South African centric, I call it natural heritage, because it's not just geology. We have storylines that we're developing in the space sciences and in marine science, conservation. So it's not just on paleontology, although we started out in this vein in the very beginning. We're working with local puppet makers, Sean and Angela McPherson, and they are well known for their work in the Cape Town. I'm going to turn this off again. Sorry about the sound. They're well known for their work with the Cape Town Carnival. And here's some puppets that we've been working on. This is Lystrasaurus and a baby Lystrasaurus. And we work very closely with them and with the scientists to design the puppets. And you can see more about this. We've got a bunch of videos on our YouTube channel about the puppet making. So it's very expensive and it takes a long time. And once we have the puppets made, though, we can use them over and over again in live shows and workshops. And they've been traveling around in the Western Cape doing lots of festivals. They actually will be going to Sweden in a couple weeks for the Bibu Festival, and they'll be doing some programs there. A big puppetry festival that they have. Here's some of our performers. We have 4 puppeteers through Jungle Theater, and these people each have one puppet that they specialize in, and we're actively training more puppeteers as we get funding in to build more puppets. And the whole idea here is to build up this, wealth of puppets and keep developing and using them over again with new shows and new workshops for children. So far, we've shown the TV program on Cape Town Television, but we're also doing live puppet performances and festivals and at local theaters. And we've just started a new partnership with the Ezekiel Museum in Cape Town to do hands-on science workshops. And I'll talk a little bit more about those at the very end here. I don't think I'll go for 45 minutes, but I'll mention those at the very end. As part of our program, we're developing or working with a scientist directly and developing as much as we can engaging teaching resources. And these are CAPS aligned, but not strictly, because we want to have, the enrichment aspect to it and not have everything just like, very focused on the curriculum, although that is a big concern. We do as much as we can with it, but we're developing resources. This is just a few screenshots from our website. And again, I apologize, it's a work in progress, but we've put in some resources that we've developed through funding from the Center of Excellence. And we also have a bunch of videos that we've made with Arizona State University over the past few years, and also some new videos that I'll mention here in a minute for kids. So you can go on and check out our website. The videos that we're making for kids, we're calling this a new series called Science Explorers. And we're trying to, this is one of our actors, this is Rowan Matthews. And here, let me close that down, the sound. And we're making these videos with children as the MC. And so we will work with some scientists in them as well, but we really wanted to design something that kids are the main presenters. And it's kind of for kids by kids. And these are educational videos that support the science behind our shows, of our puppet shows. And so here's Rowan talking a little bit about, I don't know if you can hear this.
Else in the world, which was around when the dinosaurs were living.
So we're trying to build in the content here for fun.
This is a tree fern.
So this is a series that we're starting, and we have one video made, but we're actively looking for more actors so we can do some other ones with the Ezekiel Museum and some of the collections there. Part of the website also are free downloadable materials. We have slide decks for teachers. These are mostly intermediate level teaching resources, some foundation. We have trading cards, posters, and we're going to have a whole line of products that we want to develop down the road once we get more funding, since funding seems to be the bottleneck right at the moment. We also have, I'll just show you some examples of some of the other materials. There's these kits that we're developing with Ezekiel to use in some of our workshops for children there. And these are masks that kids can make. And then they go through a series of activities and kind of become the animal and experiment with what it was like being that animal. All kind of dance, music, bringing in lots of the arts. And here's a poster. We're working with the well-known illustrator, Adam Carnegie in Cape Town. He's our main lead illustrator, and he's developing with us these posters and other materials that we can use, worksheets, in our Ezekiel workshops. And also we have funding from a local organization to develop a series of activity books. And so these again is science behind the shows. Here's just some example. These are some of our development pages where we're looking at Triassic predators and prey, and we'll have a whole Triassic Park kind of a bunch of activities in this book to support the first show that we've done. Here's another one just about burrowing, living underground. And then we kind of try to make connections with modern animals. Here's just a list of some of the African mammals that burrow to survive. And this links to, we try to kind of build in messages and linkages with mass extinctions and the history of life, of course. So as you can imagine, there's lots of material. The biggest kind of innovation lately that our program is really embracing is, since we've been working so closely with scientists at the Ezekiel Museum, we started to kind of toy with the idea of, well, if the pandemic is making it hard to do live shows, we could maybe do more workshops for children, more shows in smaller spaces and open areas. A museum like Ezekiel has a huge, these big spaces that are open that have, and they've just done a big renovation over the past 6 years and renovated all their education spaces. So there's a big atrium and lots of new facilities that we can use. And we thought, wow, it would be great to be able to reach learners in this kind of environment, being so close to the collections and having just this cadre of amazing technicians and scientists to work with. And so, and not to mention the exhibits. So they have just amazing spaces that we can use. So we started to kind of develop this partnership with them. And I've been a volunteer there for about 8 years and working off and on. And we've just made really good relationships with people there, and it's kind of taken off. And one thing we did just recently is we've started doing our puppetry and actually brought the puppets to the museum, and we have them as sort of visiting the spaces and the scientists. And so here's a video that we just did, oh gosh, about a couple months ago. And I'll just play a little bit of it. This is the puppets visiting Ezekiel.
Welcome, Kitty Kitty, to the South African Ezekiel Museum.
I'm Josie. This is Naledi, Sia, and Vinny.
Hi.
We are with the puppets from the Puppet Planet Levy.
Meet the star.
And I'm going to fast forward just to show you another part of this. This is visiting the fossil prep lab. I don't know if people can hear.
Yeah. Oh, welcome. So I just came back from Peru with some scientists and some technicians, and we were looking for Wow. Sure. So you know how dry it is in the Karoo. Here's a photograph. I took this one when I was in the Karoo last, and look how dry it is. They could see the rocks, and there's not that many plants. And that's what makes it great for us to be able to find fossils, because we can see them. Wow. Oh, I wanted to show you. Check my pick. Oh, if I can take it out the holster. There you go. So I used this to actually take the fossil out of the field. Oh, and I have a fossil to even show you guys. It's over here. Oh, look at the skull. Look at the skull.
Sure, but this is only a block of rock.
I know it looks like a block of rock, but I promise there's a fossil inside. And the way we see whether there's a fossil inside is for Sibu to uncover it for us.
Claire, wat bedoel jy uncover the fossil?
That's a very good question. I think we should ask Sibu. Let's go and ask him. Yes. Will you show us how to uncover fossil?
Okay, definitely, I'll do that using this microscope and my special tool to chip away the rock from the bone to uncover the bone. Do you want to see that?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Can you see the rock flipping away from the bone?
Yes.
Yes, I do this for days, weeks, and months, even years.
Sure, dis 'n baie lang tyd.
Yes, that's a really long time, but it's totally worth it in the end because we get an amazing fossil that was once locked up inside the rocks. This is a really great example. This is a Lystrasaurus fossil. Check, here's where his eyes used to be, these two round bits. And there's his nose. Oh, and look at those amazing tusks. Just like on you, Mr. Lystrasaurus. Check your tusks.
Dinamazinyo amahle kakhulu.
Yes, you have very impressive tusks. I bet you use those to dig up delicious plants inside the soil. Yummy. And you have those strong arms for digging as well. Yeah.
So I hope that gives you a bit of a flavor for the kinds of videos that we're doing and some of the different shows. So that's one with the Karoo Paleontology team. And we're also working with Glenn Allard. He's the natural history lead educator at AZECO. And we're looking at developing more of programs in the spaces there. And they've got, this is a kind of a little view of into their new renovated education facility. This is just one part. There's a whole area, atrium, and lots of, I think there's 2 or 3 classrooms, very, very cool new spaces that we can use. So working with Glenn and Claire and the teams there, we've come up with kind of a pilot program concept. And we just launched this a few weeks ago for the holiday program at the end of March, 29th and 30th of March. So it's very new. And we really kind of focused on 2 community groups that we brought in from Kailicha, and we came up with a program that focused on basically traveling back in time. The particular age we had the students go back to is the early Triassic after the Permian-Triassic boundary. And we focused on Lystrasaurus and Proterosuchus and some of the animals that lived then as the survivors of this incredible mass extinction. And so that was something, the messages and the learning objectives we wanted to get across to the students focused on South African fossils and our great, incredible history of deposits around the Permian-Triassic. The program that we came up with it's object-based at its core, and we use the touchstones in the collections that we meteorites, fossils, rocks, and minerals. And this is kind of the basic place where we start with the students. And then we work in the puppetry and the arts performances and the craft workshops, and also free discovery, where they can go into, or free exploration, they can go into the discovery room at AZECO. And our ultimate goal is to work in the planetarium as well, because they have a newly renovated planetarium with all kinds of shows. It's running nonstop during the week with school groups now. So that's really great. The other point I wanted to make is just this connection with deep time. In the CAPS, we focus on eras. And so our program, we keep it kind of simple for the young learners, just focusing on eras, since time is a difficult concept for them. But we're hoping to develop more programs for intermediate phase and for senior and FET phase students. So grade 10, as you probably know, is where a lot of geoheritage resides. So we want to basically, the puppetry's maybe not the greatest for the older kids, but we're going to develop programs hopefully that will pull them in, that may be more along the lines of junior paleontologist or junior naturalist programs that we're going to do through a kids club that we're going to be launching very soon, I think in May. So here's one example of kind of like this demo pilot program. This one's called Dino Doom, that we're going to hopefully launch this year at some point to do some testing. And this again would be using the object-based learning at the very beginning, where we bring the students in, they go through hands-on workshops, they touch fossils, they go into the collections, they have this really immersive experience. And these programs are about 3 hours long. The students are bussed in from different places, visitors, if there's young kids that we have space, we kind of let visitors, younger ones come in as well. And then we take them into the puppetry. They'll do a puppetry, they'll watch a puppetry show, and then they'll do some activities, either fossil casts, making shadow theaters is another activity that we're doing. And then they do either the probably the Ezekiel planetarium show on asteroid impacts and mass extinctions. And so then we have a wrap up at the very end to kind of make sure that this kind of linking all these different experiences together with the learning objectives that we want to achieve. These are just some quick shots from our program a couple weeks ago. And we did, here you can see the students came in, we started straight out with an hour session in the exhibits with some of the Ezekiel staff. This is Zaituna and some others. Glenn's in here as well. And so we took them around and they learned about Lystrasaurus from the different exhibit cases in Stones and Bones. This is exhibit Stones and Bones at the Ezekiel Museum. So we had this exploration and hands-on kind of experience with them. And then we went on to have them do the puppet show and take some time to do a craft activity where they made masks. And then we talked a little bit about what it's like to be a Lystrasaurus. And they did some dancing and singing and kind of some fun activities that way. And these are led by the Jungle Theater puppeteers with input from the scientists and myself. So, and we try to work in as much of the actual science as possible based on the most recent discoveries. But directions that we want to go, I mentioned the Dino Doom program, but we also want to do more with space exploration. We're hopefully partnering with the SKA and the South African Radio Astronomy Observatory here in Cape Town. And so we're working with Mathipa. She is running the planetarium at Ezekiel, the new digital dome. And so we're trying to design programs that will look at kind of the cosmic Africa connections that we have with space exploration and all these great programs that are getting started or have been going here in South Africa. And we've come up with a whole series of, different scripts and ideas. This is one on Fireball over the Karoo. This is on meteorites. And we're going to do a little bit of one show on meteorites. And then here's some other ideas that we've been actively developing, like you can see our puppets get around. This is on the James Webb Space Telescope and then the SKA, and we have all little stories and vignettes that we're developing. The hard part is just finding the funding to do the shows, and that seems to be, like I said earlier, kind of the bottleneck. But we're working really hard on trying to develop the partnerships with South African entities, but also international entities as well. So, but it's tough finding the funding. And then a different direction that we want to go in is marine science. And so we're looking at developing new puppets in this area and programs that will make past and present connections. This is with ocean science, looking at the ancient oceans and some of the neat topics that like how climate change is affecting the oceans today and the mass extinctions that have happened in the past. And this particular storyline is looking at ammonites. And it's related to we have a new octopus puppet character based on the Octopus Teacher film with the Foster brothers. So we thought this would be kind of a neat direction to go in and have some of our puppets be really large and able, have students be able to help manipulate them through programs. So, here's just some mock-ups that we've been doing to develop some of the storylines with the Ammonites. But just to finish off, I just wanted to mention one other aspect of our program that we're pretty excited about. We don't have the funding right now to develop it, but it's in the idea stage, and that is, as we look for grant opportunities, is to develop a mobile puppet theater and science lab. And this is just one of the mock-ups that we did. This is our concept of being able to have these pop-up displays and pop-ups, basically puppet stages with these mats that you could put down on the floor and change out very quickly, and have our puppeteers basically go on the road. And we really would like to have that whole little mini theater traveling around in some of these rural areas and some of the community theaters, and bringing a science lab with us. And so we're hoping to write a big proposal, collaborating with Zico and others to develop this idea and get the science out into communities that are harder to reach. And so this is one direction that we're super excited to go in. And we also have other directions of music development and art development, a lot of materials development and products as well. I think with that, I'm going to end a little bit early. This is just some acknowledgements, and I want to thank all the people that have made this program possible and the wonderful team at GSSA to invite me to give a talk. So thank you so much. And I guess I'll stop here.
Thanks so much, Wendy. So we have got a little bit of time for any questions or discussion.
No, I'm just wondering if we've got people in the audience who would be interested to start the funding here.
Oh my God, that'd be great. We're also looking for volunteers. So we working with, I didn't mention this, hopefully we want to reach out to Friends of the Zico Museum. And I don't know if there's anybody from that group here, but we really, we have this idea of a kids club at Zico, and we really want to, since the funding is so difficult for these big productions, and we're just getting started, we really want to try and start this kids club so that we could have programs, little mini, science activities going all the time at the museum, and have volunteers help us staff some of these. I'm donating my time, and some Zico staff are donating their time. We don't have the money to pay puppeteers for those activities, but we can at least get ourselves in there and try to do what we can. But yeah, we're hoping to find volunteers and any kind of, we thought about doing crowdfunding. And that's another thing that I'm looking into, is setting up a system of crowdfunding where we can have a token based, if you make a micro donation, you get a t-shirt or a fossil cast or something like that to get people involved. So yeah, I would really, gosh, it's hard finding the funding to get these programs off the ground.
Wendy, you talked about recruiting young actors. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, we work through Jungle Theater, and also Angela and Sean McPherson, who have connections in the arts community at Cape Town. And so Jungle is actively kind of training new puppeteers and performers for their various shows. They actually focus on environmental science, but also on African folklore. And so if you go to their website, you can see they've got a lot of different shows. And so we work with them, and then we're hoping to make connections with other arts institutions. Like one connection we don't really have that's solid is with Handspring. And so we're kind of hoping to kind of reach out and connect with some of them as well to increase our own training and to learn more.
Would there be a problem with geography, people, geographically being distant? I was thinking if you start recruiting from schools,
yeah,
and how would you access them? How would you sort of do this program?
Yeah. Well, I think we've been working with Zico. We have this idea of starting up a youth docent program. And so with our puppetry, to get younger or get older kids involved, or older learners, youth age, 14 to 18, and try and get them involved in learning the craft of puppetry and like the performance end of it. And one thing I'm trying to establish is maybe a museum puppetry I don't know what you call it, like a co-op, and it would be located maybe at the Ezekiel Museum. And we would work with other NPOs and have puppets of not just fossil animals, but living animals, and that we could train the youth to work with these puppets with families who are visiting. And so, in some museums around the world, they have these programs where they'll use the puppetry in the visitor galleries and exhibits. And so we could maybe bring some of these kids from the young learners or older kids, sorry, from outlying areas and try to train them at the museum. But it is hard. It is hard to reach out to, especially different areas in South Africa, where since we're just getting started up, we hope to kind of reach out to some of these. There's community theaters in Soweto, theater in Soweto, and other places that we'd really like to build these connections with these theater companies and see if we can, use and incorporate some of their talent as well.
John Rogers here.
Hi, John.
Wendy. And the Two Oceans Aquarium, of course,
Yeah.
very deep involvement with their teenagers, and they do things like operating their microscope, which goes up to a screen, and touchful. And then just before COVID, I went to Lyme Regis on the classic Jurassic coast, and there's dinosaur. There's ammonite things on the street lamps. But my best souvenir was having an ice cream with the cost of a chocolate trilobite. I reckon you should have chocolate trilobites for your children.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, we really, I know they have their own puppetry that they do as well, and I really want to connect with Russell at the Two Oceans, because I think Ezekiel is looking into developing a new exhibit on ancient oceans, and so I'm super keen to maybe work with the Two Oceans and develop a program that would support that exhibit with some neat puppetry and maybe some interesting, hands-on. I didn't mention anything about e-learning. We're also wanting to develop some games for kids, especially with apps. So we've been talking a lot about apps for this conference. And so one area that we're hoping to branch out in is this app development for kids, and using Puppet Planet as kind of the focus. So that's another grant proposal idea. Just finding the money.
Mike, interestingly, grew up or was born in the copper belt. So he has minerals and mining in his blood. He's a non-geologist, and he's one of these amazingly enthusiastic people who gets things done. And Mike has taken the initiative around the corner at Gansbaai and put together a fantastic rock garden and earth age display, which he's going to obviously talk about this morning. And he has a number of other projects on the go in the area, including activities with schools. So over to you, Mike. Thanks.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to just share a little bit of what we've done in Gansbaai, sort of being an out-of-the-way area, but very involved in tourism. I've attended a number of breakfasts with the OGG in Hermanus, and I got to thinking around about how could we actually do something in Gansbaai, which is not exposed to geology per se. It's about wine and sharks and whales and what have you. And I wanted to sort of open up geology to the local people, educate the local population, and just sort of create an awareness around about geology. My idea was also to sort of think about how we could link this to the tourism trade, which happens in Gansbaai and is related to the great white sharks. So I got to thinking about it, and eventually I was attending a breakfast one morning with OGG, and please, nobody here will recognize anybody on this shot because I took it straight off the internet, like I've done with many of my other photographs. So don't be concerned, you're not being exposed. Dave Morant got up at this one breakfast that we had with a piece of string 46 meters long and a number of tags on it, and started weaving his way amongst the tables. And this sparked off in my mind the kind of thing that I actually wanted to do. I wanted to take Dave Morant's rope trick and expose the general populace to that and see if I could get kids involved with it and get tourists involved with it. It was a question then of finding out who was going to partner with me. I went to the local municipality, and I went to the business of the business chamber in Gansbaai with a presentation sort of based on what the rope trick was and how I envisaged putting it together. And I got a very wishy-washy answer from them about, yeah, well, one day and we don't have budget and it's this, that, and the next thing. Sort of a municipal fend off, you know, to see actually what I was going to get up to. So I promptly ignored them and was driving around one day on my way home, and I saw the signboard. And I thought to myself, but here's an intersection which is pretty valuable in terms of the local people and the tourists and the kids and whoever else and me, because I go home to Franskraal. Could I not find out who owns this little lot and see if we could use some of their property to perhaps put the rope trick up in? And so I approached Wilfred Chevelle, who is a local entrepreneur, and his friend Susan Fasagi. They've been in partnership for the last 40 years, creating businesses in the Gansbaai area. I spoke to Wilfred, and Wilfred was immediately sold with his entrepreneurial flair and the number of the companies, successful companies that he's created, including the Dyer Island Conservation Trust, Marine Dynamics. The Marine Volunteer Center in Gansbaai is fabulous. It actually gets over about 15 to 20 students from overseas and educates them in our local fauna and flora and things that have been done around about the sharks and the penguins and the seals and what have you. He's got the African Penguin Sanctuary, which he partnered with Volkswagen to put up. So a really capable person. And as I say, he accepted straight away that he was going to get involved in this, and it was the type of thing that he wanted to be in. Without any further ado, he introduced me to my team. He gave me his poor, long-suffering PA, who was Brenda Walters. Shame her job was to watch the budget. So we spent our time fighting whenever we saw each other. But she's a great person, and she really assisted well. Ralph Watson is a marine biologist that at that particular time stuck his head around the door and was nailed. He was drawn into the thing. And he turned out to have an absolute eagle eye for correcting punctuation and spelling marks and what have you on the signboards themselves that were used along the rope. I'm going to talk about Gilbert, our megalodon shark guide. He came up with the idea, but I'll talk about Gilbert in a few moments. Kari Roots is a lovely lady. She spent hours and hours trying to dissuade me from stepping on toes, infringing copyrights and what have you on the internet, while I was trying to get pictures together for the boards themselves. But she did all the graphics, and she was absolutely fabulous. Hannes du Toit, my long-suffering do-it-all man, he had to first of all design the signboards and then put them in the ground and then concrete them in. And then when we decided that didn't work, he had to take them all out again and do it all over again with wooden boards, as I'll show you as we go along. My team from OGG Center and sort of in the rear there, Dave Morant, who came up with the idea, John Blaine on his right, on your right, that was my punctuation and spelling man and geological corrector with the signboards, and my mentor and the person that really motivated me and kept me going at the end of the day. The one person that really got behind me was John Bristow. And I'm eternally grateful to him for showing me that I can actually do these kind of things. It's not that difficult if you put your mind to it, even as a non-geologist. And then, of course, the books. I read, and I have read a number of books on geology, but these are the ones that I actually plagiarized and stole from, to the extent that I had to one day send I made a very panicked telephone call through to John and said to him, please, will you phone Bruce and perhaps Spike as well, and tell Bruce Rubridge that I'm actually stealing from his book and I'm putting it on signboards and they're going out. I was too scared. I was too scared to make the phone call. So John actually did the phone call for me. And he phoned me back in a day or two's time and said, no, you've got the blessing of everybody involved. As long as it's to the cause of geoscience and the furthering of geoscience, everybody's happy that you actually carry on and take stuff out of these books and put it onto the boards, as long as there's some kind of thank you somewhere along the line. So yeah, my thanks to John and his pouring of oil on troubled waters, especially in my head. I then sort of looked at, okay, so I had a very nice, about 400 million year old rock in the background, which I then dumped some rocks in front of, and I started to develop something. I looked at it and said, so where do I start? This was a fynbos plantation in front of the Penguin Center, where Wilfred had said to me, carry on, there's your piece of property. You wanted 46 meters, there it is. So I looked at this in some sort of doubt and eventually got my idea running and put in the beginning, the poles at the start. We started to put in the 46-meter long rope. We put in the wooden poles to support them at 200 million year intervals. The 46 meters obviously is significant in terms of the 4.6 billion years of the Earth's development. And this was the start along there. We put in the rope, which went right down to the Penguin Center. It's based sort of in the parking area as you get to the Penguin Center. And then we took it from there along there. And then we started to develop the signboards. And this Gilbert the Megalodon shark, he was, as I was talking to the marine biologist, Ralph, one day, he was scribbling on a piece of paper. And he says to me, we need somebody to guide the kids along this trail. And I said to him, so what did you have in mind? And he turned the piece of paper around and there was a beautiful drawing of a shark on it that he'd done while I was talking to him. And then the actual power or the size of the world and how small it is hit me. And the power of electronics hit me because he got onto a mate of his in London right there as we were standing and said, so develop me a shark. I need a guide. He's got to be a geologist. He's got to have a hat on. He's got to have a backpack. He's got to have a hammer. And get him back to me in 10 minutes because we want to put him onto boards for information. And literally 20 minutes later, the graphic artist in London had turned around and said, there he is, he's yours. You can tell me exactly what you want him to do. It's free of charge. Just let me know what the drawings must look like. And along came Gilbert and guided us through this whole thing. You'll see his picture as we go along, but there's one of the start boards, 4.6 billion years. The Earth is forever changing. And it sort of changes from a molten ball into the format that we recognize these days from outer space. The boards are representative and are spaced along the rope at the strategic points, just to sort of indicate what has happened geologically in the Earth's career or development. And these are some of the boards that are put into place. Bruce, you will start now sitting up and start taking note of what exactly has been stolen and what has been plagiarized. But with your blessing, thank you very much indeed. And Terence as well, thank you. I appreciate that. John Rogers also, I've taken stuff out of your books, and Nick Norman, you will also recognize some of your stuff along the trail. So it's all just been put together, and on this format, we've got our little guide in there. He's been taking through some of the boards. He's not on all of them, but these are the type of boards that we strung along the rope. As you walk from your car down towards the Penguin Center, this is what you're exposed to. Thanks, John, for getting me to rearrange this into a format that is recognizable. As you get to the end of the rope, of the 46-meter rope, you will then get a thank you. I've put some thank yous and acknowledgements into there, and the story of Earth and life is also mentioned there as being mainly the core source of the information for this. As I got to the end of the rope, I decided that we needed to have a rock garden somewhere around here, because at this point, I didn't want tourists turning around and leaving the rope and going into the Penguin Center, which is why they got there, or why they came to the Penguin Center. I wanted them to go into the rock garden. So just behind this board, I put in the rock garden, and it worked brilliantly. You'll see a little video later of how well this works. It was completely by default, but it happened to work very well. We put in a picture of the rock cycle, and then the local rocks that I could find in my area. In other words, a tourist stands on a beach, stands on a rock, and looks down and says, okay, so what am I standing on? You will see the local rocks depicted in this little rock garden. And the rock garden is under development. We're going to do another section later. But these are the type of signboards that you will see. Not very detailed, but enough to get people interested, and maybe to get them to go to Wendy's little QR code and to go and look further on there. This is what the rock garden looked like to start with. These are the signboards that were put up on little thin galvanized angle iron stands. They tended to blow over in our 65-kilometer winds. So Hannes then kindly concreted them in. Now have a look at the pathway that you had to walk on amongst the rock samples there. we started to think it's actually quite shabby. It doesn't match up to what we've done with the rope trick. So let's do some work on it. And old Hannes had to come along, and we started to explain to Hannes that he's got to redo this whole thing. The walkway here is shabby. The plants are growing all over the place. The signboards were falling over. They were shuddering in the wind, and so forth and so on. And all of a sudden, we were hit by Susan Fasaki, who walked in one day and said, no, it's got to change. And this is what she changed it to. This was her effort. Of course, she went to an external contractor and got him to do all of this. We didn't have the budget for that, but she was the boss. So she can do all of these things without asking anybody permission. And I think she did an absolutely fabulous job on reorganizing and realigning the rock garden itself. This is just an overview of, in the background there, you might see at that intersection, the signboard that I talked about, that sparked the whole idea of going to the African Penguin Sanctuary. You'll see on the bottom left-hand, the ropes start next to the cars that are parked there. And that parking bay is usually full of about 10 to 12 cars at any time of the day. The Fynbos garden was the shot with the mountain in the background that Wilfred said, so there it is, carry on. And I looked at him and I said, okay, thank you. You'll see the rope end sort of in the center of the picture. And the idea was then to divert them into the rock garden, which lies right behind it. Before they go into the penguin sanctuary to look at boring penguins, at least they'll go into the rock garden. On the right-hand side of that oval, where I say rock garden, there's a cleared area with a pathway there. And I'm waiting for people like John and perhaps Mike DeWitt or somebody else to give me, nice pieces of eclogite, around about 500 kilograms worth, or a piece of Witwatersrand conglomerate with a bit of gold in it, or some komatiite that somebody might have lying around. And we'll put it into that rock garden, and we'll develop that section of the rock garden as sort of being things that are not found in our area, but which would be of interest, such as, the start of the wealth, or the diamonds, or whatever the case may be, the oldest possible rock that we have in this country, and some of the oldest in the world as well. But there's lots of development to be done along this whole idea still, and we'll carry on with it. This is just a shot of the actual start of the rope trick, and the guy standing there in the parking bay is around about halfway along that trail. He, in actual fact, one of the guys that buried all of these poles. Another shot, just an aerial shot of the rock garden once it was completed, and that new section that's got to be developed sort of in the upper left hand of that shot. But all of the signs coming along the rope trick, you'll see they get kind of congested towards the end. But yeah, it's because things started happening and more recording was being done of what was happening. And more that we know about. It was a bit difficult to populate the billion-year marks, but we managed to do it fairly well. I'm just going to show you a quick video. I don't know how to start this. Let me just see if I can start this. This video actually shows you the tourists come into the area, and you'll notice what Mommy and Daddy does. I'll explain it as we go along. We get into the beginning of the video, the beginning of the rope. And you'll see we move along the rope the way that you would get out of your car and walk along the rope there, down towards the rock garden and the end of the rope itself. An aerial shot of the same sort of thing again. And you'll see the tourists come into this picture. There's the rock garden. There they are there. Mommy is with the red pants, and she's walking off to the penguins. But these guys have walked the full 46 meters, and they did exactly what I wanted them to do. They walked into the rock garden and started kicking rocks and looking at stuff. And they were very interested until Mommy collected them and said to them, come on, guys, we actually came here to see the penguins. So I was actually quite thrilled with that demonstration, that the whole display worked. My idea as a layperson or an amateur or whatever I might be labeled as, was to go to this target market. And it's so pleasing to see these people actually doing exactly what I wanted, what I envisaged people doing, is mom and pop with the kids coming and having a look at these things and actually standing there and discussing them, kicking the rocks, talking to each other, getting involved as a family. And you never know, out of those 5 people, you might have one geologist amongst them. And if we could create one geologist out of the whole lot, it is an actual fact, then I will feel that I've been vindicated in my efforts in this group, and I think John would be very proud to have somebody actually come from Gansbaai, one of the schools, where we're doing quite a bit of work with the schools, and we're trying to encourage an interest, and that's what it's about. It's not so much absolute accuracy. It's not so much the very pedantic way that people can be around about something they're very passionate about, but it's about interesting people. So as a final slide, this is the sort of thing that we're busy with at the moment. Jean Malan and myself did a walk the other day. We did 3 days. We did 45 kilometers along the beach in one of Jean's old stomping grounds from the Dam to Franskraal in Gansbaai. And it was just really a revisit of that Bredasdorp group and what we could see and where we were in the sequences and so forth and so on. But I did it in connection with a guy called Jason Stonehewer from Perlemoon Trails, who runs tourism trails along that beach, and he does these 3 or 4 day tours. I met his guide. His guide is Billy Robertson, and Billy and Jason I have now invited to meet with John Blaine, because John did the Hermanus Clifftop guided walk, and he's going to meet with John Blaine and possibly Jean Malan, myself, and a few others. And we're going to try and educate, if we can put it that way, or share with them as much geology as we possibly can. John Blaine has kindly offered his whole guided walk information, the whole package to us. And as said, he's quite happy to meet with these guides who do guiding on the bio side of things on their trails. But now we want to be able to empower them and let them do some geo guiding as well, using the information that people like Jean Malan and John Blaine have put together. And we will educate them as they go along. I will probably be a lot more involved with that on the actual walks themselves. And so we will start promoting geology along the coast. The development of guides in the Overberg is something we need to do. And I think we can gainfully educate people in that area to do something along these lines. There's also a beautiful site at Cape Agulhas National Park, which is sort of in the back of my mind, but it's going to have to need a lot of participation from a lot of high-powered people. I'm not going to bore you with the rest of this. And incidentally, yesterday I got the go-ahead. This actual picture is of the De Kelder's Caves. And above it, there's a walkway running. The municipality yesterday gave me their go-ahead to put a geo-trail up on top there. So that if you walk along the trail from here to Gansbaai Harbour, which is 8 kilometers, all along that trail, I want to have geological signboards that just indicate what you're looking at, what you're seeing from a geological aspect or point of view, that you can actually guide yourself along that whole trip while you're taking a walk. So those are some of the things that we are busy with, and I'm very happy to be involved with all of these projects. And I must thank you for your time and thank you for all of your inputs, the various people, the many people that I've spoken to, and really I've enjoyed doing it, and I look forward to doing some more. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Mike. That was fascinating. Are there any questions or comments? We have some time.
Craig here. Mike, what kind of budget has gone into this to date, roughly?
We put about 20,000 Rand into it. The garden that Susan actually created out of that mess that we created in the rock garden was a little project of our own, but I suspect there was about another 5,000 to 7,000 involved there. So you're coming in under 30.
That's very good. And that's doable stuff to fund as well.
Absolutely. And the beauty about it is you don't have to wait for a high-powered municipality to do it for you. In terms of small towns, you could get the local business population together to do that, and you don't have to do it in a coastal setting. You can do it anywhere. You could do it in a parking lot. I first approached Spa in our town of Gansbaai, and they were interested. They had a little bit of a fight around with the parking area that I want to do it in, because the municipality had safety issues. So the municipality is the one that you have to talk to very carefully. They have a lot of mandates in terms of public safety, public awareness, and all these things. So it's very doable in small towns. The budget is not the problem. It's sometimes the regulation.
Yeah. And Craig, just to add to that too, I mean, there's no doubt that we've got to go with wherever we can private enterprise. You know, these municipalities, even here on the Overstrand, which is very well run, they have so many challenges, you know, in terms of backlogs in housing and service delivery, and you know, they've got bigger fish to fry, if you want to call it that. And as Mike has shown, you know, there are really good commercial people out there, and if we can link with them, particularly something like the Penguin Sanctuary or the Dyer Island Trust, and give them extra add-ons to their existing, you know, tourism efforts, it all works much easier in our experience.
If I can just add to that, that little idea of getting these guides together and giving them some geo information. You don't want to overload them by any means. Their core function is in actual fact to do the bio stuff, and that's what they've done, their training, their formal training on. But they can make it so much more interesting if people, and many people turn around to me and say, Mike, so what am I looking at here? Or they pick up a rock or they point at something. It's just that basic overlay of information is what people look for. And if they're more interested, obviously, the resources are out there, and you can speak to them in private time to get the rest through.
Should I go? Okay. Thank you, Mike. That was great. Thanks so much for the presentation. But I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about the age groups in the schools that you're working with that have come through, and if there might be a venue at the sanctuary there for like a little classroom or a place where you could do programs and things. I'm just curious.
Yes, absolutely. That is one of the things we're looking at. To get to your first question, which was around about the ages, I normally go in anything between 11 and 14 years of age. And I've had quite a few knocks on the door from 17 and 18-year-olds in the secondary school here as well. So the age groups are fairly varied, but they start from anything from 11 and go upwards. I find that the main interest is around about 13-year-olds. 13, 14-year-olds are very inquisitive about just about everything. The venue itself at APS is excellent. We can do a lot of work in that place. There's a lot of room for development there.
What's the APS?
The APS, I beg your pardon, is the African Penguin Center, where this whole thing is based. And there is a lot of space there. They're actually just building on a piece now to look after wild birds as well. So Wilfred is very keen on developing that whole setup more. If we didn't want to do it there, we would go to the training center, which is right next door, and is 200 meters away from the actual Penguin Center itself, which has got massive facilities, and that's where they train or they accommodate the overseas students on their groups.
Wow. Okay.
If I go to the schools have got halls, they have got classrooms, they've got all sorts of places where we can get together. The problem with the schools has been in the last 2 years that we are not allowed to have crowds. We're not allowed to take out time from their curriculum because they are so under pressure to get through the curriculum. But that is about to change. And I think it's time to strike on those. The schools are tremendously interested in your puppet ideas, Wendy. I have talked to them about it without showing them anything. But I've said to them, there's a puppet show available. Why don't we get that here? The question would be funding to get you there.
Yeah. And that shark character, is that something that you developed? That's really cute.
That was myself and the marine biologist, Ralph Watson. As I say, he was scribbling on a piece of paper. And all of a sudden he thought, no, but I've got a friend in London who's a graphic design artist. So we took a photograph of the scribbling on the piece of paper. We spoke to the guy in London real time, and he started drawing as we were talking and sending us photos back. So it was a combined effort, but it was brilliant to see how quickly this can actually happen using smartphones.
Mike, I just want to ask you whether you're aware of the Council for Geoscience geological map, which has always been called the onshore-offshore map by a colleague of mine called Mike Bremner. And I'm a marine geologist. My MSc was from Cape Point in Isis. I used to go sailing past your area, sampling the sea floor. So are you aware of that onshore-offshore geology map?
Sounds like a terrible way of life, John, but I think John Bristow would like to answer that one.
Yeah, John, absolutely. But you see, there's one big sort of angle here as well, John. I mean, that's wonderful science, and I think Mike has demonstrated today, and that's been our whole drive. And Nick will talk about it later too, is to take this to the people. So we have no problem, and that's why, you know, the app that Cameron is developing, and I think Matt's also in that business. You know, there's a huge amount of information behind all this. but we want to start with the critical layer, which, as Mike has shown so well, are the lay persons and the kids, and you know, get them involved and get them excited. You know, lovely picture there or video of kids kicking the rock. So that's where we want to start, John. There's no, you know, there's a wealth of information behind it, as you know only too well. You've been a key researcher in this area. We obviously then will have the more technical people that come along, and that's where the app or the QR code and the database and Wendy's website will then take you down to the technical stuff. So you know, there's a bigger process here, and you know, we've got Jean Milan in the mix as well. I mean, there's a wonderful resource of marine or knowledge of marine geology. So we've got all the pieces, and we're just looking to start at the very basic layer and then add all that other stuff that sits behind it as well. Mike, maybe you want to comment too.
Incidentally, I do have some of the maps. Haley Cawthra has very, very kindly shared some stuff with me. John has given me some stuff as well. So the maps are definitely out there. I find them from a personal point of view fascinating and very appreciative of the amount of work that has gone into this stuff. But as John correctly points out, it's a bit difficult to present that type of thing to the age group that we're looking at the moment. And very often parents will look at that and tend to shy away from it because they're going to get asked questions. So we need to keep it as basic as possible. I very much find that a simple presentation is appealing to parents because then they can become the immediate expert and the hero in the children's eyes, which is great stuff, which is exactly what you want. You want that stimulus.
Okay, I just want one more comment. Our subcommittee put up a new sign in the Greenpoint Urban Park called Geology of Table Mountain beside the labyrinth there. But we went there last week and all the signs are child height. And it was very nice to see that your signs are child height and mum had to bend down. So keep the child height.
Good point. Thanks, John.
Thanks for seeing that, John. And that's exactly what the idea was. The whole way we went through designing those boards was with that height in mind.
One of your opening slides, you had a kind of a pillar with the geological time zones. Why don't you build a little rock structure with those time zones in your garden? I think it's a beautiful display of the various geological time periods. Be a nice thing to see it visually. And secondly, can you tell us a little bit more about the signboards, the materials, how you got the pictures onto them, who printed them, and just give a little background on the manufacture of the signboards.
Sure. Yes, Gert, I agree with you. That stack is beautiful, and I'd like to put that inside as soon as I possibly can get some funds back from Susan or from Wilfred. That is a great idea, so thank you for that. The actual boards themselves were printed locally by a printer in Gansbaai. It's what we use on the boats when we have to put signage on the trailers to mark who the skipper is and who the boat is and the emergency equipment. That stuff has to be very weatherproof. So we took Chromadeck, which is the actual material that they use on roofs, and we got the printer to sign print that with an overlay of polyethylene over the actual printing itself to protect that from the weather. So it's basically a piece of roof tin with the printing done on top of that and then overlaid with a covering of, as I say, of polyethylene. That is then screwed onto a wooden backing. And the wooden backing is marine ply. So we used around about 12 millimeter marine ply to secure the board too, and we've nailed that to a post.
And the good thing, John, when it comes to the signage, you know, the great thing about the penguin sanctuary, there are always people around. I think they also have security, and I think if I'm correct, they also have CCTV cameras monitoring it. You know, so you can go the extra mile of that extra cost of, you know, using quality materials, and you know, the vandalism there should also be, you know, a relatively minor problem.
The one of the great concerns around about those boards were, and this was in my mind, and it was one of my mandates, was to keep it as cheap as possible. But I also reminded Wilfred of the fact that these boards would need to change as we go on. They would rust, they would fall apart, they would get stolen, they would get scratched, or whatever the case may be. We needed to be able to replace these boards easily, which we can do now because we take off the top overlay and put a new one on. The board itself is relatively cheap to produce. It's around about 150 Rand for one of those boards. So we're not talking major cost. And if John Blaine helps me, like he does very often, he will come along with a suggestion around about a change that needs to be done to a board, maybe from a technical aspect or not quite maybe relevance or something like that. But we can then take that one board and change it quite easily without creating a major cost. Or if we need to have the whole set of boards done, that's not too expensive.
Okay. Sorry, Sharad, we've left you out there. You want to chip in as well?
No, I've just put in a comment, so we're out of time, so you can carry on. Thanks.
Very valid point, Sharad. In actual fact, I did think about this, and I want to go and see what the guys are busy with in Betty's Bay this afternoon on their display. They've come up with a color coding system. So I think I want to try and incorporate that somehow with the ages and epochs without making it too confusing. So yes, very valid point, and it will be taken on board.
John and Mike, it's Richard here. Can I make a comment? Firstly, I want to congratulate you on a fantastic job having erected something like this walk. We have a similar one that we've done in the botanical gardens, and I gave a talk on that earlier. But I know that the effort that goes into this is huge to get everything right and so on. One of the points that has emerged recently is that the concept of a box of rocks. So I think Nick Norman started it, and then other people have used it as well. So once people have done the walk through the garden, if there's a small sample of rock of each age group and each type, so you would teach kids then about metamorphic rocks and igneous rocks and so on, at the same time as teaching them about South African geology. So in other words, when they get to the end of the walk, they've got this box which summarizes a lot of geology. And so this box of rocks has been extremely important. And so I just wonder, one of the problems, of course, is that you've got quite a few samples, I guess, and have you got enough material to make up boxes for schools? I mean, each school could have a box or something like that. There are various ways you can use the box of rocks, but Barry Bryant has done this very effectively in various areas, in Vredefort and other areas like this. And it's an incredibly important learning experience with a tactile connection. So I don't know if you've got enough material. You don't need big rock specimens, but that's a possibility in the future.
Yes, no, absolutely, Richard. Thank you for that point. And John Bristow and myself have done quite a lot of work. We've spoken to Barry. We actually have 10 boxes here already, and we've ordered another 10. My idea with the current box, which is a whole package with Nick Norman's book in it, plus the rocks which come from the Transvaal area, is to give this as a presentation to Susan and to Wilfred. They can have their own box of rocks each as acknowledgement. And then I want to market them, and there are so many venues to market this with. The obvious one would be to put it in the Penguin Sanctuary and to market it from there. Last week we got the price, so now we know what we're going to target in terms of price and how to resell this thing. But there is, as you say, many opportunities available, and John Bristow has done fabulous work in getting this all together and talking to the right people and encouraging Barry to send us the boxes through. So we are in possession of the boxes. My only codicil on that would be actually to change the content of those boxes slightly. I would prefer to see 1 or 2 local samples in there, and I will be getting onto that one. Maybe not the whole box, but to include some of the local rocks so that the kids or whoever is exposed to the box of rocks will actually go down to the beach or go into the field here and find a piece of granite or a piece of TMS or whatever the case may be, and be able to compare it to something that he actually has in his possession. So yes, very valid. And once again, we're on it.
Yeah,
that's
Richard, Richard, just to add, I mean, it's a wonderful resource. Couldn't agree more. And we're working very actively with Barry, and you know, it's an amazing product. And my question is, you know, why haven't we got it out there sooner? Anyway, we'll address that. And as Mike says, one of our suggestions to Barry too is we have the South African box of rocks, and then we'll develop a local box of rocks.
Yes, yes.
As Mike says, you know, you do the local Malmesbury, Cape Granite, TMS, Bokkerveld, Bredasdorp.
Yes.
You know, so, and you can take away, you know, the South African box, and you can take away a local box. It's a wonderful resource. And next,
so what I was getting at perhaps is if you could have a sample of each rock on the Gansbaai walk, but is that asking a bit much, because you need a fair amount of rock material, and I don't know how many rocks there are on display there. They're probably about 40 or so, are there?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so you'd have to have 40 rocks in the box. Which may be a bit too much, although there may be other ways of doing it. I'm not sure, but it's a kind of a good memento for the kids to take away. That's what they looked at, and they're the rocks. So I think it'll mean quite a bit to them.
No, I'm 100% with you there, Richard. I think your idea is exactly right, and in sync with our thinking along this. Certainly, we won't have 40 rocks in there, but we need a representative group of rocks, and there are 12 rocks in there that I think would represent the Cape quite well. You know, you can't put fold belts into the box of rocks, but you can put one or two representative. If you sort of put a Nardo representative and you put a TMS representative, you know, or Peninsula representative in there, you've got some of the bigger parts of those stacks in there. You could maybe put a bit of diamic in, but that's not representative at that size that the kids are going to take it away. So you need to be careful about what you're putting into the box, and make sure that they walk around in the field and see this stuff, so they can identify case spar in one of the granites that they might encounter here in the Cape. So very valid points that you've made, and I think we will get onto that development.
And you know what, Richard, just to take it to another level, the box is fantastic, but what we also want to do is actually just put pails of you know, maybe tumbled or just nice chips of rocks. You know, there are lots of quarries around here.
Yes.
And for kids to actually, you know, when we start getting to disadvantaged communities and that, which is really where we also have to go, like Wendy with her puppet shows, if the kids walk along there and take rocks, you know, that's how I started geology, just picking up rocks on the felt, pretty rock. And it costs them nothing, and it costs us nothing. You know, the great beauty about geoheritage, Richard, you understand that everything's in front of you. You know, you have a natural museum, you know, on your doorstep. You don't have to build roads and houses and museums and roofs and all of that. It's there, you know, for free almost. And that, you know, that's our point is, you know, all of these disadvantaged kids in these schools, if they can come along, pick up some rocks, go back home and start playing with them, and, you know, getting names, wonderful.
I have to tell you this amazing anecdote. This brought it to mind right now as of kids picking up rocks. We just laid that brand new pathway in the rock garden itself. It's from a local quarry. It's just a little bit of sandstone. And one of the first visits that I had after that pathway had been left there was a group of kids walking through there. And one kid surreptitiously, he thought he wasn't being watched, but he took a handful of that pathway stones and put it in his pocket, which I thought was absolutely delightful.
Can I just ask one more question? When you went along the coast with John Milan, who was my student, did he show you the Pearly Beach granite? Did you go past the Pearly Beach granite, which is quite unusual?
No, John, we have a problem with John. He's very good on young rocks like Bredasdorp. He's awful with old rocks like granite. So you didn't teach him very well.
John, I did point out the granite to him. And I did point out the tourmaline in it, which we took a little bit of time to get hold of. I mean, they're only 30 centimeters large. We did find it. It was one of the points on his preamble to this whole walk was that we go and find that. And I spent hours trying to pinpoint it on the map. But yeah, we found it actually quite easily. It is quite a nice exposure.
We judged it offshore.
Yeah, the greater portion lies offshore as per the maps. Yeah.
Can I ask a question or make a suggestion?
Yeah.
We were talking about box of rocks, and I've been looking at it recently in terms of portability. And there's a product out at the moment where you can have an entire periodic table in a really small Perspex case. It's about 20 centimeters long. So what about looking at something like that, but also including items, and this is just a 3D printing idea because my husband does 3D printing, but 3D printing miniature versions of the fossils that you would find in the area and putting in those in the Perspex cask as an identifier. So talking about the tourmaline, having a tiny chip of tourmaline in a little Perspex box.
Yeah, Catherine, another great idea. Always at the base of this is affordability. And if you've got some examples, please get hold of them. We'll pay for the first box, and let's see what we can do.
Hi guys, it's just me chipping in, John Milan from this side. John and everybody else, and all the Johns and Mike. Thank you for taking me back in. Out of the oil and gas, the petroleum industry I've been in for 35 years, and allowing me back to look at these and be part of what's happening along this coast. And yes, John, we were at the Hachelkraal granites, and we know how gentle, and those guys with the Thomas B. Davy sampled it. There's the map, and as you know, the Bremner and Milan map, the only one so far of taking geology beyond the surf offshore. So again, Mike, good to have had that walk. And John, those organ pipes, I'll come back to you on them.
As was mentioned by John Bristow, have developed an interest in geology over many years, but particularly in the last probably 5 years or so. I've found, I've spent a lot of time looking at rock in the Cape Fold Belt particularly. I actually met John at the Bailey in the Cedarburg maybe a year ago. We were busy looking at the Puckes Folds and the megalode-cast structures with Nils Backerberg. And I had spoken to John at the time about what I had been up to. I had been looking at some rock elsewhere in the Cape Fold Belt that was quite similar in ways to what we saw, what we were seeing in the Puckes. And he asked me a number of questions about how I'd become interested in rock, what my background was, what my area of expertise or study was. And I mentioned that I hadn't studied formally at all I hadn't studied geology formally at all. And he just said it was something that might be of interest to other people, how I got involved and what I had done or what the hurdles were that I had faced in terms of getting involved to the degree that I did. And so I said, I'm more than happy to share the story. When I received the schedule for the Geoheritage talks, I was very intrigued to find that I had actually already worked out the complex geology of the Puckes Formation. Certainly had not worked out the complex geology of the Puckes Formation. And I told John that I hadn't quite worked out the complex geology of the Puckes Formation, but he didn't change the title. And so if anybody's come to the talk hoping that I would tell them about the complex geology of the Puckes Formation, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. And I think John just thought that if he puts me under enough pressure, I might be able to get it done in time. So John, thanks for having the faith in me, but it's going to take me a little bit longer than that. What did I study? I didn't study formally after school. At school, I loved geology, I loved history, I loved the sciences, but I was raised in a family that was fairly conservative Christian. So you end up being encouraged to study the Bible. And the Christian sect that I belonged to at the time felt that the end of the world was just around the corner. They even published a book called Life, How Did It Get Here? By Evolution or by Creation? And of course, the answer was not by evolution. It was certainly by creation. And as a consequence, there was a very strong emphasis on not studying academically. And anyway, at the time that I would typically have been at university, I was doing 6 years of community service because I was an objector to doing military service at the time. So I ended up not studying anything formally at all. I certainly had an interest in a broad variety of subjects. The one thing that I've always loved from my early days of growing up in Hout Bay was the mountains. We had the mountains in our backyard. We often would walk in the mountains with my parents. And by my early 20s, I was hiking in many of the sort of large mountains in the Cape Fold Belt. I'd be sleeping out. I'd be doing multiple day walks. I also got into trail running. So I spent a lot of time in the mountains and really developed an absolute love of spending time in the mountains. When I started traveling, I went to many places where there were mountains because I always was drawn to the mountains themselves and certainly also the communities that lived in close proximity to the mountains. So I spent time in the Pyrenees, I spent time in the Alps, I spent time in many sort of out of the way places. And one of the places that I spent time in obviously was the Himalayas, where for the first time I came into contact with really massive glaciers. And I found them fascinating. And it was something that sort of sparked an interest in me, this notion that ice could erode and deform mountains and rocks so dramatically. Of course, coming from South Africa, we have nothing like that here. But it was it was something that really sparked my interest, and it's remained an interest and become an increasing interest, ironically, over the years. The thing that I found particularly fascinating about mountains and landscapes was what formed them. Why do they look the way they do? Why is a mountain there and not somewhere else? Why is there a flat plain where it is? So I was not particularly interested in crystals or the chemical composition of rock, but I was interested in trying to understand particularly our local mountains, because that's where I spent my time mostly, and that's what I loved, to try and understand more about them. The one thing that I realized quite quickly is that you can find a little bit of information, but it's very difficult to contextualize that information. It's a bit like history, where you can go to Europe, find out about some ruin in front of you, but without the context, it's almost impossible. The detail is almost irrelevant because it's a fact that you have no place to hang it. And so what I wanted to try and do is to understand the framework of geology so that I could better place what I was looking at. In a very similar way to Mike Dormer, who we heard from now, I found a bunch of books particularly interesting. The first one I came across was Earth and Life. I read it multiple times, trying to get my head around geological time, trying to get a basic grip of the sequence of events in Southern Africa and how the Cape Fold Belt in particular fitted into that. The Rocks of Table Mountain by John Compton came out soon after that, or at the same time. And I found that really fascinating, that I could see what was around me and get a better understanding, a more detailed understanding of what I was looking at. And relatively soon after that, I had some time to go traveling. And I spent some time in South Africa, in the Karoo, along the Cape Fold Belt mostly, where I went specifically with the idea of looking at geology, making the travel about geology. And I took Nick Norman's books with me, which I found particularly interesting because, of course, they deal with areas further afield. And I was fascinated to be able to look at rock and start understanding what I was looking at. One thing that I really started picking up on quite soon was that there are anomalies. You look at things that are not described necessarily And you immediately start wondering, or I immediately started wondering, how can I get more information about that? What are these things that I'm looking at? They're certainly not described in John Compton's book. They're not described in Nick Norman's book. And so I realized that I quite quickly ran out of information. I quite quickly ran out of the broad outlines. I had the broad outlines rather, but now I was looking at detail. Where could I find further information about that? And of course, the next stop would obviously have been the internet. I started searching the internet for information, and very quickly you realize that there's limited access, and you're going to be looking at academic papers with the technical jargon that you don't necessarily understand, or I didn't understand. And of course, you also hit paywalls. So you might be searching for something specific, and you must now pay 20, 30, 40 US dollars, which is just not feasible. And certainly it is one of the real hurdles that I encountered when I started searching for specific detail. And it was something that I was fortunately able to get the help of some friends and family who were at varsity at the time. They were able to give me or get documents for me, search for documents, and then pass them on to me. But that quickly became, I wanted many different things, and it became a problem. Obviously, there are other ways of accessing documents on the internet, and it seems a pity that one has to go down the route of finding documents through sites that are technically doing things under the radar, but it became something that I found was at times the only way I could get what I was looking for. The other thing, of course, was there are sites. There is academia, there's ResearchGate, and there are ways of being able to get information that is available for free, and that really was a help, although it's limited. I fortunately got to know Nick Norman, and I also particularly got to know John Compton, who were extremely helpful and very happy to share their knowledge and their time explaining and helping me to find the information that I was looking for. But I did realize at the time that either I was going to go down the rabbit hole of academia or academic papers rather, and if I wasn't, then I wouldn't really get the answers that I was looking for. So that's what I decided to do. I was happy to do it. One of the things that I was particularly interested in right from the start, because it comes up in the Cape Mountains often, is the Puckhaze Formation. It ties back to the idea of glaciation, but the Puckhaze Formation is close to Cape Town. There's even diamictite, as we know, on McClare's Beacon. And it is accessible, but you have to walk to a lot of the exposures. I was really interested in many of the soft sediment deformation folding that you find in the Puckhaze. And so I started visiting places specifically to look at exposures. I looked at, I went up to the Puckhaze Pass, where you have obviously incredible exposures of subglacial plowing of sediments, soft sediments. You have amazing folding and certainly small scale folding and soft sediment folding on a small scale, all of which I had noticed in other areas. I spent time in Veinskloof Mountains, where again, there were absolutely astounding exposures of incredible folding, the large scale folding that you get in the Puckhaze, the Upper Peninsula fold zone. And I was just blown away, first of all, being up in these amazing mountains, but then looking at this astounding geology was something that really took my interest. And the fact that it was glacially deformed was something that I found particularly interesting. The types of folding that you obviously find up in these mountains is massive scale and just incredible, and so different from the Cape Fold Belt orogenic folding, that's sort of more brittle folding that you typically find in the Cape Fold Belt. And one of the things that I would do is obviously start finding, like I'd done before, start finding things that I couldn't or weren't readily available in terms of what the explanation was as how this happened. So I would do some more research on the internet. And I quite quickly stumbled across the fold zone controversy, as it's been referred to. And I realized that what I had been looking at in quite a lot of the exposures actually had some relevance to both sides of the debate. One of the things was that the glacial origin was being questioned, and I had spent quite a lot of time by then in the Betty's Bay area, the Roy Else area, where you have these incredible exposures of diamictite, but also just pocketfuls. You can fill your pockets with glacially faceted striated clasts. And at the same time, I had seen that there were other sides to the debate. I'd come across these fine lineation structures, stretching lineations that wrapped around the pod folds that we had been looking up at in the Cedarburg with Niels and John. And I also realized that there was a lot of other folding that was not linear folds. There were the massive load cast structures and pod folds, but there was certainly a wide variety of other types of folds. And so on both sides of the debate, I realized that I had seen information or seen exposures that could offer insight or offer information, maybe a little bit of insight on that debate, maybe answer one or two of the questions. And I realized that the more one visits these remote places, very often these remote outcrops, you can answer questions, and obviously more questions get generated at the same time. I also, in looking at the Paquets Formation, realized that there was a lot about the Peninsula Formation that I had seen that had similarities. You obviously in Cape Town come across the well-sorted arenites in the lower part of the Peninsula Formation, and normally only in the upper peninsula do you find the conglomeratic beds, the pebbly diamictites as it grades up in towards the Paquets. But again, I thought about some of the anomalies that I had seen, this being one of them down in the Cape Point Reserve, actually quite easy access this time, but unusual. There were a number of things that caught my attention about it. You can see in that picture that the angular clasts, the different size clasts. There were clasts with exotic lithologies. There were some faceted pebbles, possibly striated as well, some of them. There were these grooved and striated surfaces, and there were these melange type deposits. And interestingly enough, when I was looking at the details on the internet, I came across the fact that some of the early workers like Rust had felt that there was a possibility that the early peninsula or the Ordovician Peninsula was glaciogenic possibly some of it was glaciogenic in origin. And the question obviously came up again as to whether what I had seen might possibly provide some additional insight into answering that question. Elsewhere in the Cape Fold Belt, I also stumbled across other rock that seemed to possibly be glacially deformed. I love the remote parts of the Cape Fold Belt, one of them being the mountains that border the Tankwa Karoo or the Karoo in general. A lot of it is really arid. It's scratchy, it's dry, but it's just astoundingly beautiful. And we all know about the diamictites, but the rocks that I was on in this area and in other areas were Witteberg, so they were Devonian age. And other than the Miller diamictite, there was certainly no evidence, or there was no recorded evidence of glaciation at the time. But the more I walked and the more I looked, the more I came across again, anomalies, some of them that were in visually striking, amazing exposures. I came across class with exotic lithologies. I came across grooved and striated surfaces. I came across these incredible small scale folding, almost looks like metamorphic zone folding. And I also came across larger scale folding, soft sediment folding on a scale that was just astounding, and particularly so incredibly beautiful visually. And then lineations, very prominent lineations, very unusual. And the rocks sort of stand out as being very different. And there were obviously a lot of similarities between what I was looking at here and what I'd seen in the Puckays, what I'd seen in the Lower Peninsula. And the question obviously came up as to whether there might have been ancient ice elsewhere in the Cape supergroup. So the story of glaciation that seemed to have come back, I'd come back to completely randomly in many ways, came up again. And with the help of John Compton, I've been picking away at the problem as to, picking away at the question of whether there were periods if there were other periods of glaciation in the Cape Basin at other periods of time. So my experience has been that South Africa is a big country. We've got the most amazing geology. We've got the most amazing landscapes. We've got the most amazing mountains. And if one gets out into them, if you spend time in them, there's this possibility that you might find something unusual, besides just having the most amazing experience. Geologically, there are potentially exposures, things out there that you might stumble across that will be different, that will pique your interest. And then you do have to go down the rabbit hole of looking for the information on the internet, of trying to understand what you've been looking at. But in my experience, it's certainly been absolutely worthwhile, and the most amazing experience of stumbling across these things, trying to understand what you're looking at, then searching for information, realizing that maybe a description of an outcrop in North Africa has some bearing on what you're looking at down in the Cape Fold Belt. And that's my background of where I am, where I've got to, and it's certainly been a fascinating journey. And that's it.
Thanks very much, Tim. We have quite a lot of time for discussion. Any questions for Tim?
Fantastic, Tim. So when is the PhD coming? John, I presume, as the supervisor.
Yeah, kind of working away at it slowly. It takes time. It takes time. Yeah, it's an enormous amount of work, but every time I think that I've got a slight handle on what we've been looking at, something else pops up, and you've got to go back and spend several more days in different parts of the exposures having a look at it. So yeah, it'll be a while before we have got something together where we feel confident enough that we know what we're talking about.
Have you got a geological hammer?
You have some early conclusions about the glaciation?
It definitely has all the indications of being glacially deformed, but of course that could be challenged and probably will be challenged by many people. But there's certainly a lot of similarities, as I said, between the other glacially deformed rock that we have in South Africa.
You want to unload your presentation, and then we can see you as well.
Okay.
Can I just ask you whether you know a medical man called Anthony Keane, who's very keen on the Puckays and the Cedarburg?
Yes. I met Anthony up at De Bailey with John Bristow and Nils. Yes.
And I think Anthony's actually on the talk as well. I think he was earlier. Lovely character.
I also want to know if you've been able to meet Professor Isaac Rust, who lives in Strand at the moment.
No, there are lots of people that I'd love to spend time talking to, and he's certainly one of them. There are people like Henny Bleinau as well, who I think would
Yes.
be, yeah, very interesting to chat to. And yeah, it'll be nice. It'll be great to get to a point where I feel like I have enough of a background to be able to, engage with them on these sorts of subjects.
Well, Isaac's not getting any younger, so don't delay. Go today.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good idea. Thank you.
Just on the photography, have you got a partner in this?
I take a lot of the pictures myself. My partner is also a very enthusiastic hiker, walker, and photographer. A lot of it is just on cell phone, because a lot of the times when weight is an issue and you're walking in areas where carrying a bag of camera equipment is not ideal. So a lot of the stuff is taken just with cell phones, but cell phones have got pretty exceptional cameras these days. But I think most of those images were taken by myself.
Because some of them, somebody is very far, like that one with the Land Rover, you're sitting like you're across the valley from it. Are you using a drone sometimes or not?
No, funnily enough, that was also with a cell phone. So yeah, no, it's just, I think those images are just the landscape that's amazing. And of course, there's the tiny dot of the detail of the Land Rover, so you notice it. But yeah, taken with a cell phone. I've often thought about taking better camera equipment, but as I said, it just never seems to be worth it, because you end up carrying an extra, several kilos, and it's fragile equipment. And a lot of the times I'm, scrambling over cliffs and down into valleys and places that not ideal to take camera equipment. So I've stuck with the cell phone. And as I said, I think it's generally worked quite effectively for me.
Can you tell us something about Classic Stone?
Classic Stone was just a company that I started quite some time ago. It actually had nothing to do with geology. We manufacture products out of reconstituted stone, so it's a cement-based material, and it is something that I was very much interested in, the design side of things. So we do planters and furniture and a whole bunch of other products. But it is, we use natural aggregates, obviously, but it's a cement-based product. It's not concrete. It's a sprayed material, so it's highly finished and quite different to what one would expect that would come from a cement-based material. But yeah, it's a business that I've run. I started and have run for many years and continue to be involved with. But it, fortunately allows me a bit of time to get out into the mountains, which is extremely fortunate.
Yeah, and just answering Henny, when you look at Tim and you talk about drones, Tim's feet are his drone. I think anyone who was on the field trip last October in the Cedarburg will tell you that, when we looked around, Tim was sort of 2 or 3 kilometers, ahead of you, looking at something he'd seen out there. And it's what geology is all about. It's getting back to observation on the ground and covering the ground.
Yeah, and certainly I must say, I think that drones are the most amazing tool for looking at formations that you would otherwise never really be able to access in 3 dimensions. And so I've found them to be extremely useful. You're often standing on top of a cliff and trying to get to see what it is halfway down the cliff. And the only way really is with a drone, and it is incredible. You can fly them in really close proximity to cliff faces. You can look at stuff in incredible detail, and you can fly them 2 kilometers in the sky and look down at the sort of overall layout of the landscape. So they are, I think it's an amazing, and then of course you get all of their attachments where you can actually do high resolution scanning. I don't have that at all, but it's possible. And I think that is something that will play an increasing role in geology and the types of things that I've been looking at, because it really does allow you to see things in detail that you would otherwise not be able to see.
Maybe you can there's some rocks over his right shoulder there. I think I saw a round boulder with a hole in it. Is that some artifacts you got? Or
Yeah, that was, I live in Cork Bay, and that was something I found in the garden a long time ago. So quite interesting to find it in this area. And yeah, before I got into geology, interestingly enough, I was very interested, and still am. You know, again, part of what got me walking in the remote mountains to a certain degree was looking for, certainly in the Cedarburg and those areas, looking for sand caves, rock paintings, and that's ironically something that I found in the garden while I was doing fairly extensive a revamp of the garden. So up on the mountainside, but in an area that you can imagine the sand sitting at and looking out over False Bay, and using, so it's a digging stick weight. But yeah, I have a house full of rocks and box full of rocks, you know, boxes full of rocks too. It's something that, as was mentioned earlier, it's sort of, there's something about the texture of rocks, the detail in them is just amazing. And it's something that I come from a family of artists. I do art myself, I do sculpture myself and so forth. And it is something that it's another aspect of geology that I find incredible, is the visual aspect of it. There's something about the way rock, particularly soft sediment, their formation, the shapes that arise through glacial action, or alternatively metamorphic zones of high pressure and high temperature. There's something just incredible to think that those types of shapes can be generated by random. Very often they look like they have been carefully sculpted by somebody that has a very specific purpose in mind in creating this incredible detail. So it's something that it's just something that really appeals to me, and is something that has added to it drawn me into geology, because it is such a visual science, as John Compton has said.
On them, you know, earlier on you spoke about the difficulty of accessing information. Now, I think we should sit up and really be aware of this, specifically the GSSA, people like Wendy as well. You interest the kids at a early age, and now you hit this midstream barrier. You know, I also found that it's difficult to access certain documents and materials. Now, is there something that one can do about this? Any suggestions out there how to improve this rather than having to go and steal it? You care to comment on that, Tom?
Yeah, I think that having spoken to a number of geologists that have authored papers, I think that it seems to be a bit of a systemic problem, and it's the way, I think it's a problem that is almost a legacy issue, where in the past these journals would have printed beautiful hardbound books that would have been bought, and there was significant cost involved. And I guess a bit like the music industry, they've sort of wanted to hold on to their control over the cash flow side of it, to the detriment of the science. And I think that my experience in speaking to different authors is that they don't find it helps them either, because having a paper that you've sweated long and hard over sitting behind a paywall is not ultimately what you want as an author. You want it to be read, you want it to be cited, hopefully. And I think that it seems to be it's a problem that's far broader than the South African context. And I don't really know what the solution is. John Compton was mentioning recently that apparently there's a lawsuit on between Elsevier and ResearchGate for that very reason, who owns the copyright to that information. So I don't think that it's an easy problem to solve. But the one thing that I did think in my experience might help, or might have been of a tremendous help to me, is that if institutions like UCT or Stellenbosch University or so forth had and apparently there is possibly that available, but if there was an easy way of accessing information without having to be a registered student, that would be really helpful. Although the databases that UCT has, or that any one of the universities have, essentially faced the same problem. They would be subscribing to these journals, and they would be subscribed to certain journals and not to others. So it does seem to be a problem that is faced by people in academia themselves. And I really don't quite understand, or I don't know what the solution is. And it seems to be, as I said, a systemic problem that needs to almost be broken up through maybe authors themselves just increasingly only publishing in free access sites.
Yeah, Tim, I mean, it's a very valid point, and this might sound a bit odd too, but it's something that we have taken note of here, and Mike's had experience when you start dealing with the schools and getting information down to kids. It is a real shortage of access to information and basic information. And so what we found, if you look at You magazine, and I buy it for this very reason, or Marilyn buys it, You magazine every week, or whatever the case is, has Young You, and they have some amazing charts of a volcano, for example, one comes to mind, and limbs and animals, and it's a double A4. So we've been buying them over the years and scanning, particularly the geography and geological stuff. They've had pictures of the water cycle and so on. And scanning those and having them laminated and actually giving them to schools. So that's part of our program, particularly poor schools. And we know too that, our government and most of the education departments have problems actually getting school books into the schools on a regular basis. And it's quite fascinating. Hermanus in the Overstrand has an amazing number of voluntary groups, and we have an incredible early childhood development group called the Enlightenment Trust. And they have their main branches down the road here next to our Zwelithli Township. And they have a really smart computer setup, and they have a library to die for. And you want to go into that library in the day or after school hours, it is packed with young kids, all, reading books and looking for information. And so if anyone has old books you want to ever get rid of, or magazines for that matter, we'll happily take them off you. But that again is just an example at another level of the value of books and the value of accessing, just basic information. And something again is, as you've highlighted, Tim, which all of us need to look at. And I'm talking particularly from a disadvantaged community type situation. And maybe Wendy, you want to comment on that as well too.
Good. Well, thank you first for inviting me. Thanks to the GSSA for inviting me to talk at this seminar. And also a particular thanks to John Bristow for involving me in the Overberg Geoscientists group. Out of the blue, as somebody who lives a little way from the Overberg, I was surprised and delighted to be invited to participate in some of the activities of the group. And it has been a complete pleasure to have been associated with John, with Jean, and with others in the group. And yeah, it's been a privilege, and I do thank you for that. And yeah, it's only thanks to them that I am presenting for you today. I think the term geoheritage is something that has never sat very comfortably with me. I don't know if it's a fully descriptive term, but in thinking about it, I asked myself a question, and that is, what have we inherited from the earth at our feet? And the answer to that is abundant geoheritage. And I think that if we continue to consider it like that, something that we have inherited from the earth at our feet, maybe it's helpful for me to come to grips with the term geoheritage. As long as I've thought about geoheritage, I've thought of it as being really divided into two aspects. There is the geotourism side of it, which I think most of the talks of the last 2 days have been devoted to. And there's the geoeducation side of it. I think geotourism has involved, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I perceive it, taking people to magnificent geological sites like even Table Mountain, like the Friedefoot Dome, like Pilansberg, like the Barberton-Maconjwa Trail, places where you see extraordinary geology beautifully displayed. And I think that they are something that we have to work hard at. But that's not something that I've particularly involved myself. If I use the word geoeducation, I do so with great trepidation, because I'm not an educator. I'm not, occasionally people ask me if I've ever taught at university, and I've very quickly answered that I have none of the qualifications to teach other people about geology. I'm fairly good at finding things on the internet and making contact with people who can give me answers that I don't have. So if that's geoeducation, that's then what I've done. But how I've done it has been, if one thinks of the first aspect in that slide as taking people to the geology, what I've found myself doing is bringing geology to the people. And how I started doing this was, and I think probably like every geologist, have people come back from holidays now and again and ask, they wish they had had a geologist with them wherever they had been, or did a book exist? I think what really prompted me to start writing was the question of whether there was a book on the geology of the Richtersveld. I'd been in a meeting with someone, and when they saw me getting into a bakkie, they realized, yes, this guy's a geologist. He'll probably be able to answer that question. So they put it to me, was there a book of the geology of the Richtersveld? And I said, well, no, not as far as I know. And the reason people look for a book on geology of the stuff that they see every day, you drive to work in the morning, you take your kids to school, you drive on holiday, you go away for a weekend, you see stuff as you drive and you wonder about it and you'd like to know about it. It was something that nagged at me, because as somebody who watches birds, I'd always known that I could get a bird book to take with me if I was going away somewhere and wanted to be sure I could identify what I was seeing. I could find a bird book. If I wanted to know about whatever trees I was seeing, there were books I could get to help me, a number of books. And there didn't seem to be anything that would help anybody interested as they traveled in knowing more about the geology. So I thought, well, it's an obvious thing to think about, to try and sketch out what one might do, how one might do it, and take it to a publisher and see if they will be interested in what you're proposing. So I drew up a chapter, a mock chapter of areas close to home around Cape Town. I have a friend who is a cartographer, and he did a very nice map for me. I have a friend who's a designer, and she graphic designer, and she helped me lay out the chapter. So I took a trial chapter to Strake, and they liked the idea, and they asked me if I thought I could do it, and I said I'm quite sure I can. I'll give it my best shot. And we started like that. And so I started gathering information. The idea was that we would make accessible, available the geology that one sees as one travels along the main roads across the country. Well, that's all very well, but you don't start your journey on the road. You start your journey at home, you go out to the garage, you get in your car, and you start driving. You live in Johannesburg, you live in Cape Town, wherever you live, you drive around every day, probably, and you see stuff as you drive. So the first thing to do was to do the geology of the main metropolitan centers. So we did Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban, and then we selected the main highways crisscrossing the country that people traveled on the most, and we did them. And then we selected a few areas that people go to on holiday for their own sake. They're not necessarily going from A to B, they're just going into the Little Karoo or into the Natal Drakensberg or the Eastern Transvaal, as it was then, escarpment. And so we included those. So that was what the book was designed to cover. Straight like the idea, and we got going with all the fieldwork that would be involved. And at quite an early stage, I realized that I wouldn't be able to do it on my own. And I was delighted to find that somebody whose flyer I had seen in the Geological Society, Gavin Whitfield, who was doing geological tours around Johannesburg, would be prepared to do the northern areas while I did the southern areas. And so Gavin came in as a 50-50 partner, and we did the book together, and straight we're happy with that. I had to get sponsorship. I was lucky enough to have a good friend who was very senior in De Beers, and I managed to get them on board as well. When I had started doing the research, or I should mention that on one occasion when I was presenting Geological Journeys, which is what the book became called, I was introduced by Isaac Rust, who mentioned in his introduction that, of course, I stood on the shoulders of giants. And what he was referring to was this book by Marty Talliard, who'd been his professor at Stellenbosch University. And it's a magnificent book done many decades ago, long before color photography was, everybody was doing it, long before computers had even been thought of. And it's an amazing book, and Professor Talliard did a job which has survived the decades. That's an example from out of the book, and beautiful, long before the days of computer drafting, beautiful sketch of a geological section. And that was what I won't say I based my book on, but it was what was in existence when I started. I hadn't been going very long when at the university in Stellenbosch, where I was, it was before you could access a lot of stuff. This was in about 2002. And it was before one could access a lot of stuff quite easily on the internet. And so I spent a lot of time at the Geological Library, which was still part of the Geology department at the University of Stellenbosch. And one day when I was looking for some maps, I saw a copy of this book on the counter, and I found that it was for sale. Looking at it, I thought, oh no, this is a disaster. The book that I was proposing to do has already been done. I was absolutely crestfallen and wondered if I should even continue. And then I opened the book, I bought the book, bought a copy and opened it up and had a look at what it consisted of. I found that it was really quite discrete areas. They're well organized geographically, and it didn't jump around from pillar to post. It took one through the country, but it wasn't the sort of thing that would show you as you drive along the N1 what you might be looking at. And it required that you go to those places to see what geology they would show you. So I realized then, and it's become something that is a bit of a buzzword in my thinking is that I would take geology to the people. I wouldn't expect them to go to the geology. And so I proceeded on that basis, quite happy, as I had thought about it, that in fact there was obviously a lot of overlap between the two books, but they weren't one and the same thing. What I was doing was really quite different. When I talk about taking geology to the people, it occurs to me that there is a parallel example of how reaching out to people has been successful. And I show this statue of John Wesley, which is in Bristol, really to illustrate the point. John Wesley was an Anglican minister in the days 200 years ago, when if you wanted to know about the Bible, what the Bible taught you, what God and Jesus were all about, you went to church. If you didn't have a church near you, you either found some way of getting to the church or you just went without. And John Wesley realized that this was a fault in the system, and that he would take the gospel to the people. He wouldn't continue in the paradigm where if you wanted to know about religion, Christianity, you went to church wherever that was. He would take the gospel to the people. And John Wesley died an Anglican minister. Methodism hadn't been started. But today, the Methodist Church is one of the most successful churches that there is. And why is that? It's for a number of reasons. First amongst them was the fact that John Wesley was prepared to take the gospel to the people. And if my books have been, or Gavin's and mine, and then subsequently mine, have been successful, it's for that reason that we've taken geology to the people. And I think that there was a need for that, which in the same way as there was a need for people to know what bird they were looking at or what tree they had seen, there was a need for people to know what geology they were looking at. So that was the basis on which I did it. I hadn't been going very long when I had bought this book from Strake, and I opened it up and was looking at it and found a map with spots marked where one could see particular birds. And I thought, that's what I must do. That's what I will do. In the same way as you go to spot 1 or spot 2 or 3, wherever, to see a particular bird, if you want to see what is happening at spot 1 on a geological map, and here is a geological map. So it's a complete crib of what I found in the bird book that I just showed you. And so it shows you what you can see as you travel north along the N1, that is, and it doesn't show you everything that it doesn't describe everything that you will see, but it picks out the highlights in the same way as the bird book had picked out where a particular bird could be seen, picks out the highlights of the geology on the routes. So I started in the days before digital photography was producing the sort of quality that you get now, and I must congratulate Tim Lewis on his amazing pictures, whether they were taken with a cell phone or a digital camera or whatever they were taken with. They are brilliant. Thank you, Tim. In those days, digital photography was getting to the point, but it hadn't yet reached the point where you could get top quality pictures. So Strake said, no, get the best slide film you can and take slide photographs, and that's what we'll work with. So all of most of the pictures which I'll show now, and it's really just a random selection of photographs which were included in Geological Journeys, the first book. And I started in the Cape and worked not very systematically northwards. That's a contact which probably all of you have seen, or the Cape Townians have seen, this famous sea point contact that Charles Darwin and others before him wrote about, and which is just a wonderful spot for people to know about, and for people to read the descriptive plaque that is at the sea point contact. Like Tim, I enjoy beautiful scenery, and I often find a geological excuse for taking a picture. The excuse for taking this picture, which is in the book, is just to illustrate how the Cape Supergroup, which contains different groups of harder sandstone sediments and softer shale and softer sandstone sediments, how they give rise to contrasting topography. And here's an example of Bockerfeld sediments in the foreground, giving you the gentle rolling hills of the Rurns and the Table Mountain Ridge in the background. We've all seen that picture, cutting just as you approach Langsberg. A wonderful example of folding of the, I think those are lower Eka shales and some volcanic sediments, the browner bands in that exposure. But it's the sort of thing that travelers who aren't geologists look at and say, how on earth did that happen? Were the rocks very hot? When did it happen? How long did it take? All of those sort of questions. And they are very realistic questions, and people need to have them answered. And that was what the book set out to do. One of the things I wanted to show was how not all flat-topped hills are caused by flat-lying sediments or dolerite sills. On the left is a remnant of the African surface on the south of the N2 as one heads east of Swellendam, I think. On the right is a picture of a flat-topped copy in the Karoo, which is probably capped by a sandstone, possibly a dolerite. They have exactly the same effect, but they are caused by very different phenomena, geological phenomena. The sediments underlying the flat top on the left in the left-hand picture are folded. There's no horizontal sediment there. So yeah, it's just a nice illustration of how the same effect can be produced by different causes. We all admire beautiful buildings, and if they're of stone, it's an excuse to take a picture and describe what the stone is. And there are really only a few places in South Africa where one can see a lot of stone buildings. I've always been astonished traveling in Britain to see how much of the buildings in Britain are built of stone. It's not common in South Africa, but it is around Oudtshoorn. This is in fact in Mossel Bay, and those are both of Kirkwood Formation sandstone in those two places. Eastern part of the Free State around Vicksburg and Fariesburg and places like that, you can see Karoo sandstone making quite a lot of the buildings there, and it's another very scenic site. Traveling north along the N7, and just before you get to the Orange River, my eye was caught by this colorful staining on the rocks, and I stopped and took this photograph. And as somebody who had worked in the past for Rio Tinto, who spent a long time looking at the possibility of there being economic concentrations of copper in the Hybe Formation north of the river, I couldn't resist taking that picture. Further north, not much further north, but in the second book I did, which was called Geology Off the Beaten Track, we did finally cover the Richtersveld, which was the question which had prompted the writing of the first book. Wasn't there a book about the Richtersveld? And ironically, this outcrop, this exposure, is not even in South Africa. It's in Namibia across the Orange River. But it was too good not to take that picture. It's not often that one sees a fault as beautifully displayed as that. And that was in enormous sediments, which obviously do occur in South Africa, south of the river. Traveling out from that spot in the Richtersveld back to join the N7, we stopped at a little kopje and saw these beautiful stromatolites in the Nama limestone. I'm not sure if I can get the pointer to work in this format, but no, I don't think I can. But you can see near the middle of the picture somewhere, oh yeah, just about plumb center of the picture is a pen, a silver pen. So it gives you some idea of the scale of those stromatolites. Just eye-catching things as you travel, these crystals of, what did I say they are there? Andalusite? No, I can't remember. But that's in a shale baked by a bushveld intrusion. Sorry, it is written on the top there, but I can't see it because I've got something obscuring it. Yeah, just beautiful stuff. Ripple marked sandstones in rocks billions of years old, and you drive over a bridge along the South Cape coastline, and you'll see ripples just like that being formed today. They may be on the surface of a lagoon today. They'll be gone and replaced by another set tomorrow. They are completely ephemeral, and it's just lovely to know that exactly the same thing can be seen in rocks which have been tipped on their side and are billions of years old. I couldn't resist stopping at this quarry east of the road, north of Polokwane, to see what they were doing, what they were cutting. Beautiful granite there, nice, I beg your pardon. Yeah, it's just typical Southern African scenery. It's more typical to my mind of Zimbabwe than South Africa, but it's a lovely scene, and it's being turned to account there. I stopped at Makapan's caves, Makapan's hut as it used to be called, and had a good look around there. And this was just a nice picture of what the hominids would have been eating. They would have killed bush pigs, and yeah, that's the remains of them. Much smaller stromatolites than those ones in the Nama, in the Malmani Dolomites, which you see as you go up to a viewpoint near the caves. As nice an example of stromatolites as you can see. Another lovely geological outcrop of different types of sediment, recent sediment, well, not recent, but much more recent than those stromatolites of the Durban group, south of Durban, and what used to be called Mbogantwini, but which is now got a slightly updated name. But a nice variety of different kinds of beach sediments. If one drove past that in a hurry with one's eyes half closed, you'd probably say it was dolerite. And if you drive past slow with your eyes wide open, you'll see that it can't be dolerite. It's one of my favorite rocks, which is Dwightetillite. And you can see the size of the clasts in it. It's got some pretty big clasts. And that's how it weathers in the Port Shepstone is getting towards the Eastern Cape. But it's in the southern part of KZN. If you go further north, that's how the Dwightetillite weathers. And again, you would be forgiven for thinking that was a dolerite showing typical spheroidal weathering, but that's Dwightetillite. And if you want to see beautiful Dwightetillite, travel to the Denny Dalton gold mine, the old gold mine, Denny Dalton, and there you'll see tillite with huge clasts in it, massive. That boulder is probably a meter across. I think I can't see it. There is a geological pic in that picture somewhere, I'm sure. No, there's a pen on the top left-hand corner of that biggest boulder. So you can get an idea. It is a meter across. And that's just a quick run through of the scenes that were covered in that I photographed for the first mostly, and a few of them the second book. At the time Geological Journeys was published, Bruce and Spike brought this out, and the two are so different as to be beautifully complementary. So people wanting to know more about geology had two options. They have this very scholarly introduction and Geological Journeys, which is a much more amateurish production. John Compton produced this at about the same time, a lovely book and very handy for all of us who live around Cape Town. That was the second book. After Geological Journeys had been quite successful. And I should mention another point here about taking geology to the people. If the approach of the books themselves was taking geology to the people, I realized that having published the first book, this is the second one, that people weren't going to know about it. I walked into the CNA in Stellenbosch, a university town, a big bookshop. I said, have you got Geological Journeys? It's been out for a month or two. They looked through their computer records. They said, no, we haven't got that book. And I thought, well, how are people going to know about it if a big bookshop in the center of a university town like Stellenbosch has not got the book? So I thought, well, I'll have to take it out and launch it. And it's not something that I do naturally. I'm more comfortable sitting in front of a computer writing about the stuff than talking about it. But I realized that there was only one way to get books sold, and that was to have people know about them. And so I planned a road trip, and I was lucky enough to travel with a friend who is a winemaker, wine farmer, and he had decided that we should introduce wine and the geological book, and we did that together, and it worked like a bomb. There was a short introductory talk about the wines, and then I spoke about Geological Journeys. And as people looked at the book after the talk was finished, they could sip a glass of wine, taste some wine, buy some wine. So we sold books and wine together. It worked like a bomb. It never happened again, but it did work well. And when I saw how successful launching books was, I never failed to launch any other books that I wrote after that. I wrote this. This was not the next book. In fact, between Geological Journeys and this one, I produced a diamond book. It wasn't published by Strake, it was published by Jacana. And unfortunately, it went out of print, and they didn't want to do another print run, so it is now just unavailable. Taking geology to the people, taking geological books to the people, worked well. At about the time that I brought out Box of Rocks, or even after that, John Rogers brought this out, a magnificent book, lovely book, and yeah, it's a great credit to Geology of the Cape and to John himself. And he published it with the Council for Geoscience and the Geological Society of South Africa, and everyone should have it. This was an idea that came to us, or came to me, introduced by a geography teacher at the school near Franschhoek, where our children had been at school, were at school at that time. Her name is Bridget Fleming, and she's a real mover and shaker in the geographical world, and to an extent in the geological world. And the good news is that she's retired in Hermanus, so she, I hope, in the future will become an active part of the OGG. Bridget and I went to Strake together and said, we need a book for students. And my publisher, Pippa, said, that's correct. That's a good idea, but let us aim it, not at, we were talking about grades 9 to 12. She said, no. What you need to do is aim much at a much younger age group. And so we produced this for 8 to 12-year-olds. And it's a very visual layout of the sort of thing that fires the imagination of children and adults as well, needless to say. And I would say it's probably sold far more to adults than it has to children, although it was aimed at children. But it's met a need, and it's been a great success. And I'm sorry that I wasn't here yesterday to listen to Barry's talk, but Barry has partnered with me in Box of Rocks in producing physical rocks. I just have done the book, and these are just some of the pages from the book, giving you an idea of what it covers. And that is a selection of, on the right-hand side, of the books that I've been talking about. On the left-hand side is something that I produced much more recently, when I thought that there are enough good stories of the places I've been and the experiences that I've had to put into a book. So I decided to write a story of my geological experiences and self-published it. And that's what you see on the left-hand side there. It's going to Grant, and it's been reviewed by the Quarterly News Bulletin, or the Geo Bulletin. And yeah, it came out in the middle of one of the hardest lockdowns of COVID. And if you have picked up the point at all, which I've tried to make, which is that taking geology books and introducing them to people in book launches is a brilliant way to sell books. And when you've got hard lockdown, thanks to COVID, it's something you can't do. So sales have trickled along, and I'm not ashamed of the book at all. I'm very proud of it, but it has not done nearly as well as the other ones. And I'm hoping that once all these restrictions are lifted, that I can get out there and talk about it and fire people up with the same sort of enthusiasm that motivates me. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. Any questions for Nick, guys? I see the vendor are building their houses with rocks to this day. Quite a complicated and involved procedure.
Sorry, Henny, can I answer you?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned about the vendor using stone to build. Anybody who's traveled through Lesotho knows how much the Basotho have used stone to build their houses there, because I think finding clay is not all that easy, and making bricks is not easy for them, and there's all this beautiful dolerite and basalt around. And so they do use that a lot. And when they were building the wine cellar and restaurant at Tukara, they wanted to clad the buildings with what looked like local sandstone. They found that local sandstone was very hard to work. So they found a granite near near Malmesbury, I beg your pardon, that is pale gray like the sandstone and just works much more easily like granite does. So they used that, but then they had the problem of who was going to do their masonry. And they had to get masons from Lesotho. And it's an ironic story, I think, that there in the middle of the Cape Fold Belt is a beautiful stone-clad building, clad with granite from Malmesbury, which was put in place by builders from Lesotho.
Great. The Lesotho are also well known for, they know rocks very well, because they're also good shaft sinkers.
The question, what does your last book contain versus the other books?
Gert, are you asking about Box of Rocks?
No,
your very last book. You said the one that didn't sell so well because of COVID.
No, it's not a geological book at all. It's just a book of my experiences traveling. I've worked a lot in South America. I've worked a lot in Africa. I've worked as far as Ethiopia and Mauritania and in the DRC and places like that, and then from top to bottom of South America. And so it's really just a historical story of my life, basically.
I wonder if you could settle an argument for me between me and the missus. We drive up towards Laingsburg, and then on the left we also see a white band. Is that part of a synclinal axis that you can see the white band on both sides, or is it a different horizon?
There are undoubtedly quite a few people in the audience who would answer that better than I can, partly because they are better geologists, but also because their memories are better than mine. The white band is you, and I had a good long discussion with Isak Rust about it. It is a turbidite, as far as I remember, in the lower Eka, I think. And John, do you have an answer?
It's not. It's basically stagnant sea. So it's very, very low energy, dark black shales that weathers to a white gypsum. And then when you're driving on the N1 towards Langsberg from Marcusfontein, you're actually driving along the road at anticline, page 21 of my book.
There you are. You see, John has done it. John is a hotshot geologist, and he's done it, and he's done it quite recently too.
Okay. Now, it's just as I said, there's also a band on the left in the distance. So it's part of an anticlinal structure that you can see on both that's worn away.
Yeah, that's correct. Above your head is the crest of the anticline. It's very, very clear on Google Earth.
I wonder how many people realize that it's actually not a white band, but as you say, it's black that weathers to black, on the surface, not to white.
We show the students in a river cutting in the Langsberg area.
Thanks, John.
Can I just make 2 points about your book launches? The one was when Marianne Trudeau was doing GeoTeach with geography teachers at UCT. She said that working with students of the science faculty, the geology students needed to be able to write English much more than any other part of the Faculty of Science. And then the second point is Pippa Parker told me that for geology books, you have to have book launches because they want to meet the author. And in my case, luckily I've been giving public talks for years, so most of them invited me to give a book launch. But my best was at a wine cellar, I think it was Koelenhof, waar ek Afrikaans gepraat het die hele aand. Ek is baie trots op myself, want ek is 'n Engelsman in Engeland gebore. Dankie.
Yeah, well said, John.
So you also subscribe to the fact that books sell better with wine.
Yes, but also with the geologist in tow.
And he has to have the ability as well.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Henny, can I just say something about books? The one thing, I mean, we as authors, the challenge we have is as in fact you said, Nick, is the sale of these. And if one has a look at the bookshops and the thousands of books they have, they only keep new books on the shelf for a very short period. And then if they're not selling, they stick them into the storeroom at the back. And that's always a problem, So that's why, as you in fact said, Nick, that one often has to do self-promotion of your books. And I know that Pippa Parker at Strake, who's our publisher, has often told me that the authors are the best clients of their books because we tend to sell more of them ourselves to interested people than the actual shops do. It's all about the money with the shops, I guess. But also, John, maybe just to answer you as well about the students, our students needing books to work from. What Spike McCarthy and I have done recently, in fact, it was mainly Spike who really drove this effort, was the book he and I wrote a couple of years ago, Understanding Minerals and Crystals, was going out of print. And they weren't going to reprint it because it wasn't really selling that well. We always saw it as a book which was aimed at as an introductory text to the geology students. So Spike managed to get sponsorship from Sibanya Gold, and using that, we reprinted the entire book. And for the next couple of years, we, via the Geological Society, are going to be donating a free copy of that book to every second-year geology student in the country. And it's already in process. So just maybe to say that. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Bruce. That's really encouraging to hear. And just to add to your comment about books in bookshops and books even with publishers, it's such a competitive business, and it's such a low margin business that I'm frequently asked if I can let people have a copy of Geological Journeys, and I have to say no, it's not being printed. It's out of print, and they're not doing another print run. And that for me is the most frustrating thing.
Yeah, look, it is all about the money, but as you well know, Nick, as the author, you don't make money by writing books if you factor in all of your effort and time. But you're quite right. You know, if the publishers, if the book sells slowly or whatever the reason, they don't reprint it. It's a and as an author, it's a bit of a problem.
Okay, there's a closing comment by John Roth that says books could be promoted through the Geoheritage app and at geosites and with time travel display. Thank you very much, Nick. I think it's now time that we move on to the next speaker.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for giving me the graveyard slot, which usually in a conference is about the worst place to be. You know, whereas the title is quite lengthy, basically what I'm going to talk about is geology and wine, the story of the rocks that make your wine, and particularly in the Himalaya Valley. Right, this opening slide is a view down this beautiful Himalaya Valley, looking southwest, and you have the Babylon's Turung on the right, which peaks at 1,167 meters, slightly higher than Table Mountain, which they're very proud of. And the interesting feature here is that actually on the left are mostly wine farms, and on the right are mostly berry farms. And that relates to the general aspect. Now, our outline here, we'll have a short introduction. We'll talk about terroir in the traditional sense, a bit about geology, then a couple of individual terroirs, what I think about the wine growing environment, and then perhaps a new view of terroir and a conclusion. Just as an introduction here, the OGGs commenced this program to better understand the underlying geology in the Himalaya Valley, and we hope we will extend that further, because although it's fairly simple, it's got an interesting story in each environment. Interacted with a couple of well-known wine farms and a mixed farming venture to get some of the information we've used here, and we can add this to these additional layers of geoheritage and geoeducation to the wine tourism enjoyment and experience. At the same time, we're engaging with pre-primary and primary high schools in the valley, some of which are in fact provided by the local winemakers. The one on the top right there is the school at Hamilton Russell in the lower, or in the Himalaya Valley proper, down at the bottom end. And then with the Earth Age displays, such as Mike Dormer showed us at Gansbaai, we're developing a similar one at Harold Porter Gardens in Betty's Bay, where we had almost like a good to go environment. And then ultimately we'll add one perhaps in these schools, but hopefully if we can get around the administration in the municipality here in Hermanus itself. You know, terroir is something coming from the northern parts of South Africa, and spend most of my life way north of South Africa. Terroir is a really fancy term, and when you go to Europe, and particularly around France, it's very important there, and it's almost mystical, and I find mostly designed to confuse the wine consumer, which is really the bulk of the population. And when you talk in some detail, the wine markers are concerned with the climate. It's the angle of the sun on the vines, the rainfall, temperature, wind, and the sea breezes. There's the soil they talk about. That's very important to them. You know, and they go into a lot of detail, and they do a lot with their soil to understand the chemistry and what they need to add to it to make the vines grow. Because as you know, in Europe, limestones are very important, and we have very few limestones in our wine growing areas in the Western Cape particularly. And then the geomorphology seems to come into their understanding of terroir, because that affects elevation, aspect, altitude, and slope. And the underlying rocks tend to be ignored, or generally just referred to as shale, granite, sandstone, or alluvial deposits can be referred to as alluvium or cobbles. And then there's coffee cliff, which is actually quite a rarity and becomes quite an interesting aspect of the wine growing area here in the Himalayan Arda Valley. But they all are aspects that come into play to provide the foundation on which our wines grow and which our excellent wines are made. Geology as such, as a description of the origin of the topography, the cycles of rock formation, continental drift, location of continents, mountain building, etc., tend to be somewhat ignored. But if you start to talk about geology in these broad senses, incorporating all those things, the layperson can become even more confused. So we will return to the winemaker's vocabulary in this talk and just refer to shale, granite, sandstone, and coffee clip. And in the Himalayan Arda Valley, we see all these features in play, but actually very few of the winemakers really address the geology. Just a brief sample of the, or a summary of the geology in the area. The Himalayan Arda Valley is outlined in red there. This is Hermanus here, the broad sweep of Walker Bay, it's 20 odd kilometers across there. And it's characterized by these two major down-faulted synforms of Bockerfeld rocks in this area here and in that area here. And in between, particularly where the Himalayan Arda Valley is, you have these block-faulted environments where you have the full sequence of the Cape supergroup between the Table Mountain and the Bockerfeld, downfolded and juxtaposed, and in the Himalayan Arda Valley, in fact, juxtaposed with the Cape granite. So some very significant throws on some of these faults, and the one up the Himalayan Arda Valley is probably of the order of a couple of thousand meters, where you get upper Table Mountain group juxtaposed with the Cape granite, and then on the other side of the valley, overlain by Peninsula Formation. Just a summary section in the valley here. We've got the basement rocks, the granites. We do not see any Malmesbury group in the valley here, but it's present to the east of us around Stanford and inland from there. We've got the Table Mountain group, particularly the sandstones of the Peninsula Formation and the upper units as well, up to the anyway. And then in the main unit of the Himalayan Arda Valley are the shales and mudstones of the Bockerfeld. And then over that, the altered products, which incorporate ferricrete or coffee clip soils and clay. So there's a Google image of the valley. You can see here, this is the Onrus River that flows down here. This is the main fault that sweeps up this valley and crosses over there. And this is a wedge of granite that lies in the upper Himalayan Arda Valley. Down here is the Himalayan Arda Valley proper, which is underlain by Bockerfeld shales in this wedge here. These rocks behind, this is Upper Table Mountain group, Chodini and forget it again. And then over this side, this is an erosional contact I've not seen myself between the Cape granite and the Peninsula Formation sandstones that build this tower of Babylon's Turin. The wine farms that we've actually interacted with and we have information on so far is Hamilton Russell down here, Sportfontein up in the upper Himalayan Arda Valley, Creation up in the Himalayan Arda Ridge, and Dipcot, which is a mixed purpose farming operation where there's some lovely exposures of the Bockerfeld. So a cross section through the upper Himalayan Arda Valley shows you the relationship between the units. You have the coastal hills above Hermanus dipping in towards the north, and then down faulted against the wedge of granite, and that's as it is at the upper end of the valley. And then a number of block faults eventually with a horst building the Babylon's Turin. and the vine and berry farmers lying in that valley. So what do we have? We've got this is probably old hat to most of the geologists here, and in presenting this to maybe more of a lay group, there would be more information on, in fact, how these rocks came to be where they are and how they were deformed. But just for the purposes of this, in order to just provide a bit of information on the underlying geology as it relates to the formation of the soils and the rock and the vine growing environment, I'll just summarize this. Well, basically, the Cape granite, which basically is a foundation of practically all the Overberg region, although it's not commonly seen, it occurs in upfaulted blocks directly underlying the dominant sandstone mountains. It's coarse-grained where we have seen it, and we have managed to find one decent-sized lump that came out of a vineyard preparation area. It weathers very easily in humid environments to form clays and sand. These clays can commonly be kaolinite, which is a white cream color and a very sticky clay. But because of its moisture retention capabilities, it's very suitable for retaining moisture and nutrition for vine growth. The sand, which is predominantly quartz with larger granite fragments, then provides a well-drained soil. And that's very common in the upper Himlanada Valley, where the granite forms the bedrock, and they all recognize that in that area. So there's a sample of the granite, the lump that we found, which now resides at the entrance stairway at Creation Wine Farm, and is a particularly nice example. Where it gets very weathered, here just nearby, and we saw this actually after the heavy rains in the last year, and they were excavating this foundation for a shed, and that deeply weathered granite is extremely sticky, and the vines further down slope seem to be battling a bit at first, but I think they seem to take a root now. But on the upper parts of this, and this is just down slope of the fault, which separates the upper Table Mountain group from this granite, you get this really sandy humic soil, which the humus is largely degraded fynbos, but this very prominent gravelly stone line, which sits there slightly above the weathered bedrock, and is always an interesting feature of these sort of terrains, and others in much drier areas. We've got the Table Mountain group, sandstones predominantly made up of quartz, as we know, with occasional quartz pebbles, and it's predominantly silica dioxide. Deposited in layers on a slowly deepening floor, and beryl characterized by cross-bedding formed by currents on the seabed, forming large-scale ripples, which is really beautifully exposed in many places along the cliff path in Amalas. These sandy rocks were derived by erosion from the hinterland, which itself was made up of older granites and gneisses and older quartzite units. And when one remembers that back in those days, 500 odd million years ago, there was no surface plants, and there was very little to hold the eroding material to the land, and it washed down and cleaned out and was able to separate these clean quartzitic sands from any finer material that then would have washed out further into the basin of deposition. These rocks weather to form boulders and sandy slopes at the base of the higher mountains around the Overberg, and these sandy slopes also form a well-drained soil, but of course below that lack suitable nutrition for vine growth. It really becomes quite important where you have a steep slope like on the Babylonstoren, where that sandy scree washes down over the granite, which provides the clay-rich substrate. This is an example of the Table Mountain sandstone along the cliff path, some beautiful planar and cross-bedding environments with curved bedding and cross-cutting structures, which indicate I believe, thrusting along bedding plains, which are beautifully exposed in many places along that route. And in the mountains to the east of Hermanus, we have the amazing Cascade Folds in the Musselburgh. So at the top of this sequence, we then have the Bokkerveld group, which is the cyclic alternation of mudstone and fine-grained sandstones that then, when subjected to pressure by burial down to at least 2,000 meters, as we understand, gets a more fissile texture, which then is called shale, made of quartz and phyllosilicate minerals, predominantly chemically silicon, aluminium, and iron. So also derived from weathering of erosion of granites and gneisses, but being finer grained, these minerals were then deposited in deeper water than the sandstones, which are near shore and in the deltas. So the weathering of this Bokkerveld unit formed by oxidation of the micas and clays to form an iron-rich red-colored rocks, which are not prominently exposed, so they're much softer than the sandstone, but they provide very suitable nutrition for vine growth, and because they lack good drainage, they have good water retention characteristics, courtesy of the clays. Here's some of the examples. This is up on the R32 near Creation Wines. They're actually very finely laminated mudstones. Here they've not even developed a shaly texture, but the weathered alternation is really quite spectacular. This, in fact, were rock faces in a cutting that had been rained on recently, so it is particularly spectacular, but you can see the very fine, lamination. This is near Benguela Cove on the R43. It shows very nicely the multicolored weathering of the Bokkerveld, and also prominently this vericrete or coffee clip gravel, which caps a lot of the Bokkerveld in this area. And it's in itself is a very interesting feature and erosional remnant of a much older land surface. So the ferrocrete is this iron-rich duricrust, which is an indurated or hardened layer in or on the soil. The soil particles cemented by iron oxides, which are precipitated from groundwater to form this erosion-resistant layer. In this area, the soil covering is eroded from the surface of the ferrocrete, which is exposed as a hard rock surface, and many parts of old ferrocrete layers may remain as remnants of this old erosion surface. Along the Southern Cape coastal belt, ferrocrete and siltcrete are remnants of the African erosion surface dated at early to mid-tertiary, and these remnants extend from east of Riversdale towards Bredasdorp, and the eroded gravels now part of the soil profile in the Hemelanada Valley. There are two remnant hilltops on deep cuts in the Hemelanada Ridge appellation, where this hard indurated duricrust. Then, as I'll show you at Spoortfontein, there is a ferrocrete similarly formed from groundwater along the fault, which is quite an important feature on that one part. So here, this is at Diepgat. You have this remnant on the left here of a very nodular ferrocrete, and on the right here, this hard ferrocrete capping, which is a massive, very silicious ironstone, in fact. And you can see from the high level there, it's about 250-meter elevation at that point, and it will be one of the last remnants of this African erosion surface that lies much further away to the right-hand side to the east, in fact, towards Swellendam. In fact, in road cuttings, you get this coffee clip, which is this degraded ferrocrete, forms this residual gravelly soil, and it lies with an extremely sharp contact on the deeply weathered Bokkerveld mudstone, which is quite an intriguing feature. Now, what you see when the vineyards prepare their lands, they in fact rip through this, and it tends to get rather mixed up, but it forms actually a very useful growing substrate for the vines. This is vineyard preparation on one of the new vineyards at Creation. You can see there the gravelly degraded ferrocrete with a humic soil, and you can see it's been mixed up already with the top layer of the weathered Bokkerveld shale mudstone below. Now we go down to one of the two particular vineyards I want to talk about. This is the Hamilton Russell Vineyard down in the Himalayan Valley, and this is the original wine farm where Pinot Noir was first planted in this valley, and one of the earliest in South Africa. And the lower part of the slope there is underlain by Bockerveld group shales and fine sandstones. And there's a really nice sharp contact, and you don't actually need to, very difficult to see on the ground, but you can see from the level that where the vines are planted to, that defines the contact between the Overberg sandstones above and the Bockerveld shales below. In the background here, you can see this is the Mosselberg, which has this spectacular folding in it. And this is the Fernkloof fault, which defines the boundary between this block and these down here. This is the Hermanus waterfault that runs along the bottom of the Hermanus. Down in the bottom of the valley here, you have Bockerveld group down thrown against Table Mountain group sandstones on the left, with the Onrus River flowing through the base. Now, the area that John Bristow and I got involved with, and I must thank him for his assistance with that and his heavy lifting of some of the materials, was this Rossel block, where they were planting some new Pinot Noir, an area that had been already used, but I'm not sure what was planted with previously. But these vines get a bit old after about 20 years, I believe, and so they were preparing this, and they start by digging a whole series of about 1 meter deep pits for chemical sampling in order to define what additional chemicals they need in the soil for their vines. In most cases, it's calcium and phosphorus are the two things that are missing in the soil. So in the top there, you have 30 to 60 centimeters of a well-drained growing layer, which is in this case degraded Fairy Creek gravel mixed with a sandy loam soil and organics, usually mixed because of the previous planting. And you can see that mix has gone down into the upper layer of the saprolitic bedrock. Now then you have the 90 to 120 centimeters of the saprolitic weathered bedrock, which is very clay rich, and it has really no predominant structure. It's really just pretty massive clay. But we've been able to see in other places roots penetrating down into this over a meter into this clay, very fine rootlets. And then below that, of course, you have the level of the groundwater in cracks and fractures in the bedrock of the Bockerveld, which is of course many meters deep. Now, in preparation for the annual Pinot Noir festival at the end of January, Don and I got involved in preparing these two glass cylinders, which were samples taken from those profiles in the Rossel block, and they show very well, but not in the same mixed up fashion. But at least they show very well the differences between the different layers in that soil profile. The solid pieces of shale at the bottom, in fact, didn't come from there. They came from deep cut, where there is a nice fresh quarry. But it gives the example of the different rock types in this sequence. Now, there are not many of the wineries up the valley here that actually have a soil profile display. The other one that has a very nice display is Newton Johnson, which is just above them in the upper Himalayan Valley, and they have a very good understanding of their soils, and they display it very well. At Ataraxia, they have a sample profile where Kevin Grant refers to the fact that he has 14 different types of soil, and he will be first on our list to visit as soon as the wine making season is over during this month. So then we move on to Spoorfontein wines, which is also very interesting. It's a block that they grow wines. This is this major fault that separates the granite from the upper Table Mountain group sandstones in this area. The winery sits right there, and there's this prominent silicified fault that runs along here. And out in this area, they have what they call their Pinot Noir block, and it's located particularly over this very iron-rich soil. There's a block of massive ferricrete that sticks out from the side of this road, and down in this area, an extraordinary boulder, which I'll show you a photograph of. And you'll also see some pictures of the profile in that vineyard, which really makes you wonder how anything grows. Elsewhere, they grow Cabernet on these granite-based soil, which has got a very sandy substrate. And here in the upper this Overberg unit up here, which is a very sandy unit, they actually have Merlot and some other varietals. So this is this rather unusual ferricrete cemented conglomerate that I pointed out to you. It's got these rounded pebbles and various grain size, unsorted fragments in a fine sandy matrix, which just has been pulled out of the vineyard there and put on the side of the road. Now, my issue with this is about 50 to 100 meters above the bed of the Onrus River. So these rounded pebbles were obviously part of the original Onrus River bed in this area, and it's been mixed up with more angular fragments through soil erosion down the slopes of the hill to the south, and is a bit of an enigma, but I intend to actually do a bit more investigating down there and just try and understand a bit more how that all came about. And I think it just is a first indication of some of the change in the whole geomorphological profile in this valley, that you get these rounded pebbles way up out of the riverbed environment. This is a picture. This is the massive ferricrete that grows, that is just downslope of the fault, separating the sandstone, the granite from Table Mountain Group sandstone. It's a very sandy rock, and it could well be re-cemented, eroded sandstone. And then on the right-hand side is this ferricrete breccia and gravel, which forms the soil, so to speak, in which the vines are growing there. But they clearly enjoy it. The very broken up surface nature is what really, in my mind, makes it very important for vines, that they don't get their feet wet, but they like to get their roots wet. So even though when they irrigate, they spray at that level, but it seeps down very fast through that gravelly surface into the underlying water storage substrate. Now, talking about gravels, this is another unusual outlier further down the valley in the Hemelanade on the R32 opposite Plato Extremes vein school. This is in fact an abandoned channel of the Onrus River, about 30 meters above the present channel. And local vines there grow very well on this sort of well-drained, pebbly, gravelly sand. And there you can see beautifully the contact between between underlying Bockerfeld fine-grained sandstone and shale, and these sort of pebbles of this conglomerate lying in here and becoming finer grained sand and pebbles further up. And then on the top is degraded ferricrete gravel. So 3 different environments that I've been able to show you here. But basically the bulk compositions that are provided by this are in fact as laid out here. The granites are quartz, feldspar, and then a combination of minerals from hornblende, biotite, cordierite, and garnet. And these are the minerals that are present in the granites and also in older granites, of course, and then of course in the Bockerfeld groups, which are derived from erosion of this pre-existing rock. The clay minerals developed during the weathering process for different soil textures and water and nutrient retention properties, and weathering of the TMG sandstones contribute largely textural variability, sands, gravels, providing permeability to soils. And then these ferricrete gravels on the top provide an added layer of permeability and maybe even something special to some of the wines. if we want to take another view of how terroir can be viewed, we have the traditional way, which is on the left, climate, soils, geomorphology, geology at the bottom. But I think, in fact, you can add a more interesting layer or an additional interesting layer to the discussion in these wineries or these vineyards about the geology, where it came from, how it was shaped into the geomorphology, how it was weathered into the soils, and the climate that in fact provides the final part of the puzzle to make the vines grow so well. This is actually an excerpt from after that January Pinot Noir celebration. This is a Frenchman. He'd never been here before. He was invited, and his title for this article was "Are the Himalaya wards on their way to becoming the first true appellations in South Africa?" You know, appellation is not or vineyard appellation, not a common thing in South African wines, but he felt it was clearly distinctive between the Himalaya, Upper Himalaya, and the Himalaya Ridge, that the wines from those areas, and particularly the Pinot Noirs, were very distinctive of their soil profiles and, of course, from their bedrock. He barely mentioned the bedrock, but I hope that next time he's out here, we'll have a chance to add that additional layer of information to his expose. So we do believe that, in conclusion, that additional geological information can add a further geotourism dimension to this amazing wine experience, not only here in the Himalaya, but in many places. And I know Matt Mullins has done some work on the Rustenburg estate and has written up something very nicely on that as well. Thank you. Feel free to comment, criticize, pay a visit. And we'd like to acknowledge Hamilton Russell Vineyards, Anthony Hamilton Russell, and his farm manager, Johan Montgomery, the winemaker at Spoorfontein, Niels Ace, and the partners of Carolyn J.P. Martin at Creation, and of course the good traditional multi-purpose farmers of Peter and James Davison. Thank you.
That was excellent, John. And if I can jump in, you didn't say that you and I are also developing a sort of geological guide to the best wines. So watch this space. You know, we'll be selling our own Platters wine guide based on geological factors.
Yeah, we might become the new geological negotiants to develop our own range of Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays in this valley.
Absolutely. And we're looking for fees for the OGG as a consequence.
Yeah.
I think a booklet on this very matter is very much overdue. And we could start a whole new trend here.
Yeah, Henny, I think that, you know, that it's a bit like an elephant in South African wine. In fact, many vineyards and many winemakers that I've come across or heard across that as soon as you mention your geologist, they almost want, you know, they almost want to pour wine down your throat to hear more, which is not a problem, but where do you start? And I think considering my stage of life, the Himalaya Valley is a really good start. There are geologists in many parts of these vineyards, these wine growing areas that should tackle these things. And I think we can really add an amazing dimension to wine tourism. And particularly when you start to get foreigners like this Frenchman who visited here, that he was remarking specifically on the fact that these wines reflected the actual soil derived from geology underneath, and that is very specific. And people would like to know, well, how did those rocks get there? So yeah, there's definitely an opening. We'll start with a small brochure.
Right, thanks, John, for that. Very interesting, and it's something. What's his name? Matt Mullins and I went and had a look at Thelema together quite recently, and I know that Matt is planning when he's next out here to maybe do Tukara, which is the estate between them, between Rustenburg and Thelema. But my question is whether there are any of the estates that you visited where they have made two wines from the same grapes, from the same cultivar, from different blocks with different geology. I know that Fairview have done that, and I included a text box in Geology Off the Beaten Track describing the two vineyards that produce a Shiraz, I think it is, for Fairview. They're both quite small vineyards, and they make them in exactly the same way. They pick the grapes at more or less the same time, and the wines are quite different. And you know, it's as much geography as it is true geological terroir. But I just wondered if there are any comparative studies that have been made on the wines.
Nick, yeah, not studies as such that I know of, and in fact, just because of the layout of the different geological blocks in this valley, I can't think of any of them where there's one wine farm that covers two distinctive rock units, like have got a granite block and a Bockerfeld block. And that just seems to be a characteristic of the way the geomorphology has worked in the valley, that you get a very distinct geomorphological separation between the Himalayan Ada, the lower part of the upper Himalayan Ada, and then the Himalayan Ada ridge. They're very distinct geomorphological breaks which define those. And in fact, the break between the upper Himalayan Ada and the Himalayan Ada ridge is in fact the watershed between the Onrus River and the Klein Rivier. The Klein Rivier flows east from that point all the way around the end of the Klein Rivier bag, goes around in the order of 20 or 30 kilometers and comes out into the sea at Amanus. So it's in fact a very unique river in that respect. You can stand on the top of the Mosselberg apparently and see the source and the mouth in one 360-degree view. So no, in answer to your question, I don't think there are any vineyards that actually cover two geological terrains.
Thanks, John. And I think just as a final comment, if I may say, that one of the advantages that a huge winery like Fairview has is that they source their production from farms that are not their own farms, that are sort of widely separated. And so they have the luxury of being able to do that, which a single estate producing only from its estate is not able to do. Yeah.
Actually, Nick, that's very true. And in fact, they all do it to a certain extent from what I've been able to glean. But there's one relatively new vineyard in the upper Himalayan Ada called Al-Heit, A-L-H-E-I-T, where they don't plant any of the traditional vines that are grown in the valley. I can't remember offhand what they are. And they in fact, they don't focus on any particular wine style. They actually focus on producing whatever the vineyard gives them. So they have a number of different varietals there, and that's going to be a very interesting one to go and visit.
Yeah.
Because that's a vineyard, that's an estate that's laid out on Bockerfeld and upper Table Mountain group sandstone. So it'll be very interesting to see how things vary there.
Now, John, sorry, are you aware of that the farms where they actually have a soil profile? You know, you touched on the fact that they like to have their feet wet or their roots not, or is it the other way around? So that people can actually accurately determine across the farm what the geochemistry is underneath it. You know, like you would have a cross section telling you what the certain depths are. Do you think that is already being applied extensively or not?
Well, I think from what I've seen, and I guess this little bit of work we did at Hamilton Russell has told us something, and also what we've seen at Creation, particularly where they excavated also for a shed on the edge of one of their vineyards, that the roots of the vine, they have a couple of strong roots holding them up, because most of them are trellised anyway, so they don't need a lot of grabbing power. So they just stand in, these vines are sort of grounded in things. It's very gravelly generally. And the fine feeding roots go way down. And they go, and although the vines obviously need some added nutrition in the near surface to get them going, I don't believe that they add a lot more to it after that, that they rely on whatever is in the substrate, with those little tenderly roots go down a meter or more, 2 meters, to get their nutrition actually from the weathered bedrock. I mean, in fact, one of the most interesting examples I ever saw was, in fact, in Portugal, where in the Douro Valley they grow these port vines on unbelievably steep slopes, on sort of 1 meter wide terraces, and their museum there shows how these roots can go down meters and meters and meters in a very dry environment to get the nutrition and the moisture that they need to grow. So I think vines are, they're lovely things to work with, lovely things to sample, but they're incredibly hardy. And don't forget that all these vines are clones. You know, they're like the deciduous fruit trees. You start with a good rootstock and then you stick on like what you want. And then you've got to rely on what's in your substrate to feed it. And that's where the flavor and the differences in the vines come from. It's actually what's in the substrate.